My name is Jacob Price. I was 34 the night everything changed. The date was October 13th, 2019, a Sunday that smelled like wet leaves and oil sting from the harbor. I still say the date out loud sometimes, like a talisman, because the way time presses on that night feels different from any other. It keeps its own calendar. I didn't grow up on the bay, but I learned its moods quickly. Grand Traverse Bay is a bowl of water folded into northern Michigan, wide, cold, and honest. In summer, it's a mirror. In October, it becomes a lung that exhales fog. I moved to Greyhaven 2 years before that October to get away from a life that felt too loud. I wanted small-town silence, a place where my hands could steady again on oars and on wood. I fixed boats, ran supplies to anglers, and taught a shelter dog named Boone how to sit without chewing the dock ropes. The town's heart was a strip of storefronts that smelled like coffee and salt, and a lighthouse on Marrow Point that locals jokingly called the Old Tooth because it jutted into the water like something caught and never swallowed. There are people in Greyhaven who say the bay keeps records. They mean it. Storm patterns, ice breaks, and in the way older fishermen talk, the way the water sometimes keeps a sound or a shape like a secret. I didn't believe stories, at least not the way other folks did. I believed in charts, in motor maintenance, in wiring diagrams, and the steady calculations that let a man know where he was. But people are made of fissures. People who come to small places carry their own cracks, and those cracks catch local stories like lint. Ethan Cole was the kind of friend who steadied me. We met at the boat shop. He had a laugh that could pull you out of your own head, and an addiction to late-night coffee that matched mine. He was 29, with a scar under his chin he said came from a raccoon, and a way of telling the same joke until it softened into a kind of prayer. Maggie Boone ran the bait shop and had eyes that saw the weather like a mood ring. Sheriff Tom Larkin was patient in a way that reminded everyone of old trees. His patience could take the shape of a warning if you pushed it, but mostly it kept things from getting mean. People in Greyhaven had history with the bay. There was the wreck of the freighter Helena, which had gone down in a wind that arrived like a fist. There were the kayakers who lost their way and found their boats later. Bodies unmarked, faces lined as if with someone else's sorrow. There were stories about a buoy off Northcroft Pier that flashed a light even when the county had turned the power, telling them it was dead. On a winter afternoon, old men would sit on the pier and trade versions of the same night until it looked like a tapestry sewn from half-truths and superstition. I liked the stories because they made the bay feel deep, like a place that had been breathing for longer than any of us had names. I disliked them because they made practical people laugh too easily. Laughter covers the place where fear could sit. And there was something private about fear, too. I had my own reasons for watching the water. I carried an absence from the city, a marriage that unraveled quietly, a daughter I saw on alternating weekends through a glass screen of distance. The bay offered a different shape of belonging, one where quiet might knit me into something smaller, steadier. In the weeks before October, the water took on a late-season restlessness. The fishermen said the fish were confused, boats came back with nets tangled in something like hair, and the gulls moved in tight knots. Electronics in town were twitchy, radios picking up faint voices, boat compasses leaning just slightly off true. Nobody blamed anything in particular. At that time of year, the North always seemed to be testing you. I started going out later than usual. The weather turned quickly then. Mornings that promised sun and evenings that folded into fog so thick the headlamps seemed to be pointing at the inside of a pillow. I fixed a little aluminum skiff, christened in a way I still think was hubris, the Lurk. It had a quiet motor and a paint job that matched the color of old mailboxes. Ethan teased me about the name. He said I was trying to attract trouble with a name that sang. Maggie gave me a flashlight she swore would outlast eternity. Sheriff Larkin checked the registration and said nothing, only added, "Take a jacket. Water does funny things to you." Those were the ordinary things people did. They offered practicalities because human beings do not like to leave the theater of the world without an umbrella. For the first 700 words of this, I wanted you to know the textures, the people, the harbor, the way the town held its breath. I wanted you to have the map in your head before I point to the place on it where the seam opened. I wanted you to feel Greyhaven as more than a backdrop. I wanted you to understand the small compromises we make, the truth of working hands and borrowed promises. I'm telling you names so you can measure me against them, so you can see where a man stands and where he begins to tilt. The main story, the part that leaves marks, begins with a decision made in a soft hour, a moment that feels like an answer to a question you didn't remember asking. I was running one last supply trip out to an old duck blind that belonged to a man named Walter Crane, a retired deckhand who lived alone on a spit of land called Hollow's Reach. Walter had called me that afternoon, voice thin with something that might have been fear or weather. He said he heard banging for days, as if someone was knocking on the hull beneath the water. He said his dog refused to go near the shoreline. Walter was the kind of man who called the sheriff only after he'd tried everything else. That, to me, meant something beyond broken pipes. I loaded the Lark with bottled water, a spare pump, a toolbox, and a thermos. The sky outside the marina was wearing a bruise. Ethan stood with his hands in his pockets and offered me one last cigarette, though he knew I had quit. "Bring your head back with you, Jake," he said, and he used the old nickname like it was a stitch on a shirt. I didn't expect the bay to be anything but itself, restless and enormous and indifferent. I did not expect the lights to go wrong or the radio to pick up a transmission that wasn't there. I didn't expect the sound that would make my teeth ache, like a machine trying to speak through cotton. But the bay has its own appetite for choice. Some nights it wants to be simply water. Some nights it wants names. That night, as I pushed off into the dark, it began whichever thing it wanted to be. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fog closed around the Lark like a curtain. For a while it was almost beautiful. The kind of soft, swallowing quiet you think you can walk into and not come out changed. My headlamp threw a pale coin of light that bounced off water that didn't want to give anything back. The motor hummed like a sleeping thing. My hands found the wheel because hands remember work when the mind is trying to run away. As I crossed what the maps called Main Channel, my compass dipped a hair to the left and held there, like a thought that wouldn't finish. The radio wanted to sing, but only static came, and through that static there was a sliver of something like a voice, or maybe just the memory of a voice, a syllable stretched until it resembled the sound of my own name from far away. I told myself it was the Helena, a ghost of old fairies long gone. I told myself to trust the charts. I told myself the bay plays games with men who listen too hard. The Lark's bow sliced through a cold that felt like an accusation. My breath fogged in front of me, and the air tasted metallic, like pennies and the cold after the first snow. I scanned with the flashlight, sweeping the shoreline. Hollow's Reach was a thin thumb of land jutting northeast, dotted with reeds that looked like someone had put out a warning. Walter's place was a squat shack with a warped porch and a leaning canoe tied up by a rope that also seemed reluctant to be there. When I tied off and climbed up the bank, the dog was nowhere. Walter's screen door hung open on a hinge that squealed in the fog. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned low, the kind that makes everything the exact color of old money. The bed was made. A chair was turned away from the window. A radio sat on the table, its dial frozen between stations. A pitcher of water on the table had a ring of crusted salt around it like a tiny shoreline. On the porch were footprints in the mud, one set leading away toward the blind, another set going to the boat and stopping. The wet impressions were deeper than they should be, like someone had been carrying something that weighed more than a person. I followed them because after a certain amount of time in a place, you learn that curiosity and duty are the same thing. Besides, Walter had been a deckhand his whole life. No man who'd seen the North Channel in a gale would willingly vanish because the coffee had gone cold. The duck blind sat a short walk from the shack, half hidden in reeds. It was an old structure, built on pilings, paint peeled away in thin curls. As I approached, the boards of the walkway groaned like an old man's joints. The blind's door was unlatched. Inside it smelled of mildew and the oily scent of duck decoys. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, pieces glassy as teeth. There were gouges on the wood, shallow like fingernails, leading from the doorway to the back window that faced the bay. At the window, I saw something that kept my hands from steadying for a second. A shape beneath the water, not a fish nor a shadow, but a slow, deliberate curvature that made the surface of the bay crease like a skin being pinched. It pulled away when my flashlight hit it, leaving ripples that moved like fingers dragging through a hidden fabric. Walter's dog had left hair on the porch rail, but there was no blood and no sign of a struggle inside the cabin. The man's Bible on the shelf had a leaf folded at no particular page. On the kitchen counter, the coffee mug sat cold and untouched. There was a scrap of rope tied into a knot that looked wrong to me. Not like the practical knots of a deckhand, but something imitated, like someone had watched a sailor tie a knot and then attempted it with fingers that didn't know wood and brine. I stepped back out and the fog seemed to rearrange itself. The bay was breathing a low, wet breath, each exhale pushing marsh-scented air up my nostrils. I heard faint and far a knocking. Not on the blind, not directly nearby, but on the surface of the water. 3 slow taps, then 3, then a longer scrape. It could have been driftwood catching against a submerged stump, but the cadence suggested intention, as if the water itself was trying to keep a time. My skin went cold. There are different cold things, the cold from wind and the cold that lives in the bones when you know a place has noticed you. I tried to call Sheriff Larkin on my phone, but the signal was a smear of nothing. Ethan's text sat unread in my pocket, a joke about lighthouses and old teeth, which felt suddenly obscene. I decided to check the shoreline to look for anything I'd missed. The reeds parted, and my boots slipped into mud soft as old bread. Something snagged the toe of my boot, a line, slick and covered in slime, that disappeared into the water. It was attached to nothing visible at the surface. I crouched, pulled, and the line gave like a breath. There were barnacles along the part that had been underwater, but then higher, crawling with seaweed that clung like hair. What was tied to the other end of that line I couldn't see at first. The water stirred as if something had tested the tether. Then, slowly, something dragged itself along the bottom toward the blind. A net, heavy and encrusted with the bones of things that had snagged it. Inside the net, my eyes played tricks. I thought I glimpsed a pale shape, like a sleeve or the cuff of a coat, and the unmistakable glint of a button. Buttons wash off things or sink with them, but the sight lodged in my skull like a hook. I hauled the net to the bank because there was a stubborn part of me that wanted to be useful, even when the world tried to tell me usefulness was a joke. The net came up heavy, heavy enough to make my arms burn. It smelled of fish and something else, sharp and coppery, like old pennies melted into blood. When the net cleared the water, the wet fabric folded, and in the folds was a scrap of cloth. Not weathered canvas, but the precise weave of a child's sweater. The yarn was olive green with a single yellow stitch. A small, torn scrap of paper was tangled in the netting, half buried in sea sludge. I brushed it free with my thumb and found handwriting cramped and rushed. Help. The letters were partial. The rest was torn away, eaten by time and water. But that single word hammered in my chest like a bell. Help. The rational boxes in my head, charts, currents, logbooks, rattled and then fell open. Where there is help asked for, someone in Greyhaven goes. I should have left then. Most nights, the safe thing is the right thing. But there is another law that beats the safe one. If a person asks for help, and you are the sort that can't ignore that asking, the world will test you until you either answer or are answered. I stomped the mud from my boots, shouldered the net, and carried it back to the Lark. The bay had gone quiet then, with a silence so full it seemed to press my eardrums inward. I pushed off, net slapping the side. The compass needle wavered hard, then spun like it had been released from a trap. My engine hiccuped and died, the way an animal gives up a fight, and then started again. In the moonless light, I could see the pilings of other blinds reaching up like the ribs of something sleeping beneath the surface. As I guided the Lark back toward the channel, the surface of the water trembled, not with waves, but like the skin of a drum being struck softly in a pattern of 3. The same tapping, only louder and closer now, as if whatever was knocking had learned the layout of my bones and knew where to make the noise hurt. I reached down to steady myself and felt brush against my ankle, cool, slick, like the skin of a fish, but wrong in a way that made the hair rise on my forearms. I jerked back and my flashlight caught on something just beneath the surface. A pale hand, the fingers webbed with seaweed, curled as if clinging to the side of the boat. For a moment I didn't breathe. Then other fingers unfurled from the dark, thinner than a man's, and longer, with nails that had been worn to a kind of translucent edge. They wrapped around the gunwale and pulled. The lark tilted. My heart flew into my throat. I lashed at the hand with the butt of my flashlight. The contact was a wet, mucus sound, and then a suction that seemed to try to pull me forward. Whatever had hold of the boat released with a sound like the bay inhaling. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was a presence with a mouth. I sped the motor and didn't look back until the lights of Greyhaven were a smeared promise on the horizon. Behind me, the blind at Hollow's Reach stood patient in the fog, its door swinging slightly as if an invitation or warning. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the table in Maggie's bait shop until the sun grew a pale coin, and Sheriff Larkin came in with coffee and an expression that carried a map of the town's worries. He listened to my story without the usual scoff the town saves for men who tell ghost stories. When I finished, his face darkened. "We'll get a team," he said. "We check the water first thing." But morning felt like a word stretched too thin. In Greyhaven, when the water wants something, it tends to collect witnesses slowly. The town set out boats. Ethan refused to be left behind. Walter's dog, when it was found days later, came home with only one paw clean and his eyes gone like someone had sanded them smooth. The tape on the sheriff's radio recorded static for hours, and then a small pocket of sound that, when they played it back, made everyone in the room bend forward like it was speaking directly to them. A child's humming, wrong in its melody, with a whisper beneath that could have been a name. I had thought that a man's measure could be taken in the work of his hands. That belief began to feel fragile. The bay had given me its first calling. It had tapped my ribs with a rhythm. It had replied when I answered. And I had the awful clarity of someone who has seen a wolf and yet keeps walking toward it because turning away feels like a betrayal. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. They brought the town to the water like a ritual. Boats glimmered along the channel, lanterns bobbing like a string of anxious eyes. Sheriff Larkin organized the search with the deliberate patience of a man who understands how a community leans on his steadiness. Ethan refused to stand idle and took a small skiff with me, and Maggie kept the bait shop open late for hot coffee and to listen for news. Sam Klein, a contractor who used to do underwater welds, volunteered his side-scan sonar. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a marine archaeologist from Traverse City with a taste for things other people called cursed, insisted on coming along because some professions are excuses for curiosity. The sonar found a shape the first morning, just off Pettigrew Shoal, an odd bruise on the bottom that looked like a long, flattened box. It shouldn't have been there. The charts marked nothing at that spot but silt and a submerged ridge. We sent Sam down with a harness, eyes lens bright and jaw set. He'd been under the bay before. The water doesn't often surprise him. When he surfaced, he was white at the lips. "It looks like a hold," he told us, voice that had trouble carrying the words. "Like a little room, pilings pushed around it, and there's fabric." He spat the last word like a bitter pill. They worked carefully. Divers are people who move slow for a living. Beneath the surface, hurry is dangerous. When they opened the scow, more a metal box than a boat, its sides eaten by time, the town smelled salt and the iron sweet of old things unsealed. Inside were objects that seemed to have been collected like offerings. A child's boot with its laces gone, 2 brass buttons, an old brass compass that spun wrong, and, wrapped in tar and a skin of decades, a faded olive green sweater with 1 yellow stitch. I recognized that stitch before my fingers touched it. It was the mark that had haunted me since the first net came up. We laid the sweater out on a table in the sheriff's tow lot, and the threads were full of bay grit. A scrap of paper clung to the collar, barely legible. "Help! Come!" And in the pocket, folded tight around something small, was a photograph so smudged the faces were whispers. When the developer's light washed across it, the image sharpened. An older man with a grin like a weather vane and a small girl tucked under his arm with a gap-toothed smile. Walter's face unmistakable, and a child I didn't know. The town had old missing persons notices stacked like a deck of used cards. Some were recent, some more than 20 years old. The lines of ink showed names: teenagers, a canoeist who never returned, a little girl named Maisie Caro whose parents had moved away and who had been listed as missing in 1998. The sweater didn't match any one case cleanly. The bay had a way of mixing years, like someone stirring relics into a single bowl. When Dr. Shaw examined the sweater and the other items, she became a cartographer of grief. "This isn't random," she said. "There's a locus. Someone or something has been using that spot for a long time. It collects." She used the word with a scientist's curiosity and an undertow of dread. Tide patterns, eddies, these old scows that get snagged, things get trapped and preserved. But these items suggest purposeful placement. Purpose is a dangerous word when you're standing in a small town watching your harbor cough up history. The sheriff tried to make the response mechanical. Check leads, notify the state police, run DNA if they can. But towns run on softer engines than policies, memory and murmured warnings in the way parents stop letting children wander to the water alone. Maggie closed early that night and swept the floor like a ritual. Ethan and I sat on the pier and tried to be men who could laugh. We failed. The bay began to speak in familiar ways. The tapping, 3-3 long, returned at odd hours, sometimes from the mouth of the channel when I stood on my porch, sometimes under my window at dawn. The sound was a metronome that rewired sleep. I dreamed in the cadence, a small hand rapping on the inside of a bathtub, a knuckle at the hull of a boat, the rhythm of someone tracing the outline of a name. Sleep, when it came, lived near panic. I woke once with the taste of salt in my mouth and the distinct impression that someone had been breathing my name under the mattress. I began to carry the scarf my daughter had knitted for me the last winter like a talisman. It smelled of detergent and little human habits that keep you tethered. People ask afterwards, and they'll ask again, why a man keeps returning to the place that watches him. There is guilt in the shape of obsession. For me, part of the pull was simple. I'd been the first responder in a town that was my refuge, and the net had yielded a child's clothing. Part of it was the more private engine. I had been a man who lost a marriage, who sometimes had to hand his daughter back to a woman at the end of a weekend and watch her recede into a car seat. The bay's cruelty had a way of arranging coincidences, until they felt like accusations. Sheriff Larkin tried to shield me, but towns keep their own counsel. The more I listened, the more I heard the bay folding people's histories into its depths. Old Mrs. Tully swore she'd seen lanterns bobbing in patterns that spelled out syllables. An ex-merchant named Briggs told a story about a boy who vanished off a pier in the 70s, and decades later, a marble with his initials washed in during a storm. The town cataloged its grief in the half-jokes and the sore places people cleared in conversation. One night, 2 days after the scow was raised, I went down to the blind at Hollow's Reach alone. The sheriff had asked me not to, and the team was resting. Their work had a rhythm that included exhaustion. But exhaustion doesn't stop the bay from tapping, and curiosity is a cruel companion. I took only a lantern and the sweater, wrapped in plastic. I thought, irrationally I suppose, that the sweater might want to be returned or read. Maybe the bay was a ledger and wanted to balance something. The fog was thicker than before, a thing that eats edges. My footprints were swallowed. When I tied the lark and stepped to the blind, the boards underfoot were slick. The lamp in my hand made little islands of light. The pace of my heart felt like the tapping, like a drum too close to the ear. I stood at the window and looked out. The water there was odd, not still, but folded. It moved like fabric being pulled slowly through a hand. From the dark, something sighed. Not a noise, but an exhale that made the hairs on my neck stand up. In the glint of the lantern, I thought I saw an outline, a bend, an elbow, the suggestion of someone or something pressing against the shallow of the bay, watching the blind. Then, as if the bay wanted to make it impossible for me to be merely an observer, a voice came. It wasn't through the radio. It wasn't the wind. It was a small voice, half under the water, and it said my name. Jake. I stood frozen because to move felt like ripples in a pond that could wake something huge. The voice said it again, softer, as if underwater, as if pulled through reeds. Jake. Sometimes stories go public on the next line. Sometimes they quiet and leave you with a cough. My hand found the sweater at my belt. The yellow stitch showed like a beacon. I couldn't promise that I knew what was sane. I only knew the logic of the person who hears a cry and can't pretend not to. You go. So I tied the sweater to the post, leaned over the gunwale, and called back into the dark, "Who's there?" The answer was the bay taking a breath. The water around the bow made a pattern of 3 taps, 3 taps, and then a long, patient scrape, like something that had been rubbing at a name until it came clean. I don't know if courage and stupidity are different until later. I do know I slipped my hand into the water to steady a rope, and fingers, slick and cold and not quite human, curled around my wrist. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fingers closed around my wrist with a cold that felt like the seam between 2 winters. I kicked, because the body remembers how to survive even when the mind has already checked out. The hand's grip was everywhere and nowhere. Not bone, not flesh as I knew them, but a pressure under the skin that tasted like old pennies and river mud. The rope in my other hand tightened until my knuckles whitened. "Let go!" I shouted, though my voice sounded small and ridiculous against that enormous patient dark. The hand didn't answer with words. It answered with a memory. The bay showed me a place that wasn't a place. It filled my head with images the way tide fills a harbor. A little girl with marshmallow hair who laughed when her boots sank into mud, a man with a grin like a weather vane teaching her how to tie a knot, a birthday cake that melted in a sun-crazed field. Faces I had seen in photographs, faces the town had whispered about for years, unfolded beneath my eyelids. It showed me Walter, hair like rope, calling for his dog. It showed Maisie, arms flung wide like a small, brave boat. There were others, faces that had been folded away in drawers of memory. A teenage boy with a chipped tooth, a canoeist who had loved the stars. When the images passed, the bay put something new in my palm. A small, damp scrap of paper that smelled of salt and old glue. On it, written in a child's hurried hand, was one word I had already learned to fear and love: help. Under it, in letters pressed too hard, a name I had not known I wanted to see: Maisie. It hit me then, a terrible clarity. This thing in the water collected names the way people collect trinkets. It couldn't remember them on its own. It kept them in objects and in the sounds that came when the objects hit the hull of whatever passed over them. The tapping, the rhythm, a ledger of calls. Maisie, I breathed, and the bay for a moment was only tide. The fingers loosened, not from mercy but curiosity. It was like shaking hands with a creature at the edge of comprehension. It studied me in the hollow it had made, as if wondering whether I might be useful. All at once, I felt ridiculously, painfully human. My daughter's small laugh in the kitchen when she learned how to pour cereal without spilling, the way she tucked a paper boat into my coat. The memory was a tether strong as any rope. It was then I understood something I had not wanted to. Some truths are expensive. The ledger the bay had built demanded balance. The water around my wrist tightened again, but this time it was less a snare and more a contract. I had a choice that wasn't phrased as such. Leave and carry the knowledge, or trade. The thought rose like a surge. Give up yourself and let the ledger slip some names free. The selfish part of me, the part that still wanted to return to small-town mornings and the porch where Boone slept, screamed to cut and run. But there was a child's name on the paper, and my hands of their own accord found the little knife I always kept at my belt. I worked the blade free with fumbling fingers and saw how the bay watched. Whatever it was felt like a creature with old, patient curiosity. It wasn't monstrous in the cinematic sense. It was something older and messier. Weather given attention, grief given shape. When I lay the knife against the rope that bound whatever lay under the water, the rope the bay used to hold its offerings, I understood that I could free something by making a new wound in its holding. I cut. The rope was wet and tough and screamed a sound I would hear long after the salt dried from my hair. The thing under the water tugged, surprised, and then the surface of the bay convulsed. A small object slid from the tangle and bobbed to the top like a creature that had remembered how to breathe. It was a marionette of mud and fabric at first, then resolved into the shape of a small wooden doll, painted in the old way, a chipped smile. I scooped it with hands that shook. The doll felt absurdly warm, as if it had been kept in a pocket all these years. From deeper in the netting came a sound, a very small human sound. a breath that belonged to someone with lungs that had not been used in a long time. The water cleared, and impossibly, a tiny hand surfaced clutching toward the sky. Not a miracle in the tidy sense, more a thing the bay had kept behind a curtain and now, at a cost, returned. Maisie coughed and spat and blinked. Her hair, when I touched it, felt like riverweed in sunlight. Her eyes were the same gap-toothed wonder the photograph had promised. She looked at me with the stunned trust of a child who had been given a shore. "Jake," she said, like a question and a prayer. I shouldn't have been able to lift her. The physics of it was ridiculous, and yet I hauled her into the skiff and wrapped my jacket around both of us. The bay quieted as if it had been listening for the sound of someone calling a name and had decided for a breath to be generous. Behind my knees, I felt the cold fingers, no longer gentle, wrapping themselves around the hollow of my elbows and the back of my neck. They weren't letting go. I turned to face the water and saw in the slow, terrible way of things that have rooted over a long time, a tangle of faces and fabric and wood pressed to the underside of the surface. Not malicious, not hateful, but steady as drowned rope. They watched me like a congregation watching a man perform an impossible kindness. "Take me," I told the bay, because some offers are necessary. The logic was simple. One trade for many. It felt like bargaining with fate. I kissed Maisie's forehead because even in that ridiculous calculus there was a human ritual left, blessing what you could not save. I let go of the tiller. The water caught me like the hand of a lover who had waited decades. As I slid down from the skiff, I wasn't swallowed so much as folded into a long, cool silence. There was no panic there, only an odd sense of completion. A ledger balanced, a name spoken and returned to a mouth that could say it. They found the Lark 2 days later, washed ashore at the mouth of the harbor with its motor warm and a child's wooden doll tucked under the bench. Maisie woke in the hospital with no clear memory of where she had been and with a sweater that smelled of marsh and my jacket around her shoulders. She clutched the doll like proof that night was real and that the world could be fixed at all. They never found me. The town hung flags on the pier and laid my boots in the sheriff's locker. People told versions of my end that made them feel safer. Drowning while trying to help, taken by a storm. Some said the bay claimed me because I made a bad bargain. Others, looking at the doll in Maisie's hands and the yellow stitch that had appeared on one sleeve of the sweater, a small extra loop of yarn I knew I hadn't sewn, said the bay keeps what it needs and gives back what it can. At night, sometimes the tapping returns, 3-3, long. It sounds like a clock in the chest. Maisie sleeps with the doll under her pillow and draws pictures of a man with tired eyes who went into the water and left a rhythm behind. Ethan sits on my old porch and drinks coffee that's gone cold. Maggie sweeps the shop and smiles in the same way someone smiles after learning a hard lesson. If you ever stand on Marrow Point when the fog climbs and the night is the color of old coins, you might hear a small voice under the water calling a name. Some say it says Jake like a lost echo. Others swear it's someone else, a child calling for a father. Maybe I'm there, writing in a ledger the bay can understand. Maybe it only sounds like me. What I know for sure is this. The bay remembers. It keeps records in the way only great bodies of water can. In the objects it returns and in the rhythms it taps against wood. It keeps names. It offers trades. And sometimes, because men will always be clumsy saints, someone answers. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Nathaniel Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and the night everything changed was October 13th, 2012. People like to package a story with a neat why. A heartbreak, a dare, a literal storm. For me, it began with a map, a rusted old tackle box, and a promise to myself that if I could just get away from the fluorescent hum of the office and the cold stack of unpaid notices on my kitchen counter, I could breathe again. Grand Traverse Bay had always been the kind of place like that. Wide, trustworthy water that looks like it'll hold you. It also held centuries of other people's tragedies tucked under its waves, but I didn't know that then. Or maybe I did, in the way everyone knows things they refuse to say out loud. I'd grown up inland, no more than a 4-hour drive from the lake, but Grand Traverse was my escape. The town of Ashfield Point had an old pier, a bait shop with a dented neon sign, and a lighthouse whose light cut through fog like a slow, patient eye. The people I went with that weekend were friends from different corners of my life. Gavin Shaw was the kind of man who never met a risk he didn't like. He owned a beat-up cabin on the North Shore and a boat with a name painted crookedly on the stern, Blue Hollow. Marcus Hale, a quiet school teacher with a hidden laugh, came for the peace. He could sit for hours watching water and be content. I think I went because loneliness loves company, and the thought of a dark, cold lake felt honest compared to the plastic voices on my phone. We arrived on a bright Friday afternoon, the kind of October air that tucks you in with a sweater and promises you nothing dangerous. We packed the boat with thermoses and fishing poles, a cooler full of sandwiches, and a lantern that hummed like something pretending to be from another century. The water at daylight was forgiving, glassy, with a few ripples and gulls circling like punctuation marks. Old-timers in town told stories about shipwrecks in the deeper pocket off Sugarloaf Point, about sailors who swore they heard voices calling their names through the fog. They said it like a campfire tale, cocking an eyebrow, but there was a sheen to their faces that made the hair on my arms stand up. People there respect the lake, they worship it, and fear it like an old king. Gavin navigated Blue Hollow like he'd been born with a compass in his chest. He loved the hush you get when land drops away, and all you hear is your own breath and the steady hum of the motor. Marcus and I leaned on the gunwale, letting the breeze sketch nonsense on our faces. We joked about terrible bosses, about failing at love, about how if we were abducted by aliens, at least the view would be nice. It felt safe in that laughing way, until we edged past the point where the water turns a deeper, older color and the sky thins. The light changes there. The lighthouse looks smaller and somehow more accusing. The captain of the bait shop, a stooped man named Eli Prescott, had told us not to push too far after sundown. "The fog comes quick," he said, squinting as if he could already see it. We smiled and promised to be careful. We were young enough to say yes and mean it. As afternoon slipped toward evening, we found a small cove to anchor in and drink stale coffee. The map I'd brought showed an inlet with a cluster of rocks nobody bothered to name anymore. On the map, they're just smudges, like an admission that no one wanted to spend much thought there. We cast lines and watched bobbers rock in the water. I remember the way the sun gave the bay a molten rim, and the gulls cried like they were arguing. I remember Marcus making an offhand comment about how the lake felt watchful. Gavin shrugged him away and offered another sandwich. That was the rhythm. Small comforts when the world tightened. We weren't the only souls out there. A handful of other boats drifted like scattered thoughts, lights flickering as the sun said its goodbyes. The horizon blushed and then darkened. When the last warmth left the sky, the kind of cold that seems to come from the bones of things took its place. Our lantern looked tiny and foolish on the deck, and the Blue Hollow creaked like a chest settling. That's when the air shifted. Not all changes come with drama. Some are subtle until you look back and realize the line where life split. I told myself we'd head back when the fog rolled because you do sensible things, at least until you don't. Gavin said he wanted just one more cast by the old wreck. He liked to test edges. Marcus said nothing, but his hands tightened around the pole. The three of us, each with our own small private reasons for denial, pushed a little farther out. The wind dropped, which is the worst kind of sign on a lake. The water stilled until it was a black glass reflecting nothing. Then, without warning, the fog appeared. Not like a curtain, but like breath. Soft, thick, smelling faintly of copper and something that used to be old money. It rolled over the surface, swallowing the nearest boat like a hand, and then the next. Within minutes, visibility dropped to a few feet. The lighthouse reduced to a halo, somewhere distant and unconcerned. The real nightmare started when the fog brought with it a sound. At first, it was a tapping like fingernails on wood, far off but precise enough to make the hairs on my neck prickle. Then a call, low and human, threaded through the mist. My name. I remember how my name sounded different there, stretched as if someone had taken the syllables and worn them thin. I looked to Gavin, asking the question my voice couldn't form, and he only narrowed his eyes, scanning beyond the lantern's glow. Marcus swallowed hard. We told ourselves it was another boat, or a drunk on shore, or an echo playing cruel tricks. You can be persuasive with yourself when the stakes are still small. But the tapping came again from the water, from beneath the hull. Something brushed the blue hollow's side and left a trail of cold that climbed up through the soles of my sneakers to lodge beneath my ribs. The lantern guttered, the engine coughed and hitched as if pulling against an unseen hand. Gavin fumbled for the radio, voice brittle. "This is Blue Hollow. Anyone." Static ate his words. And then I heard a voice right behind me. Not a distant echo, but a whisper at the nape of my neck that said, perfectly and with the clarity of a snapped truth, "Nathaniel." It was my name, in a voice I knew to the marrow. Not the present me. Some echo of me. The kind of voice that would only be used by the thing that had been waiting to remind me of things I'd tried to forget. Something moved in the fog, not with the grace of a living body, but with the patient, unstoppable motion of tidewater. A figure, tall and soaked, blurred where nothing should have been. It wore clothes that could have belonged to a mariner from another century. Coat heavy with seaweed, a face that the fog refused to let me see clearly. But hands as pale as old bones, reached for the blue hollow, like a man longing for a ladder. Gavin lunged, the lantern swung, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw eyes beneath a hood, shining like coins. By then the world had narrowed to the three of us, the lantern and that breath of fog. The engine wouldn't catch, and the tapping on the hull had spread into a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like someone counting us down. That's where the first episode of what happened to me truly begins. I don't know how long I sat there in the fog with that voice at my ear, with the cold pressing in like a second skin. All I can tell you now is what the lake taught me that night. That silence is not empty, that names are hooks, and that Grand Traverse remembers more than anyone in town will admit. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The fog didn't just stay around us. It leaned in, pressing like a living thing. The lantern's glow shrank until it felt like we were holding a distant star between our hands. The figure reached, and the water closed over its lower half, as if it had risen from under the lake itself. Its coat trailed sea-slick ribbons of weed. Gavin cursed and shoved at the bow. His fingers found something that wasn't rope. For a second, I thought he'd grabbed a rope, a handhold. Then whatever it was slipped free with a sound like someone breaking winded timber. "Gav!" Marcus shouted. His voice cracked in a way that made me realize he was no longer the calm schoolteacher I knew. The three of us had become different versions of ourselves, less certain, more raw. Because whatever the bay was unspooling, it ate pretense. Gavin swung the lantern like a club and screamed something wordless into the fog. If there was anyone else out there, they had their own reasons to be quiet. The tapping on the hull became 1,000 small knocks like a code hammered by fingernails. Objects around us, an empty thermos, a bait box, seemed to hum with a low electricity. The radio still spat static, but beneath it there was a pattern, like undersea animals making music. Then the water rose against the blue hollow's side as if someone had turned a slow, invisible tide. The boat shifted, rolling, and in that tilt, Gavin lost his balance. He lunged, reaching for the rail, but the thing in the fog found purchase on his sleeve. He yelped, short, surprised human, and then the sea took him. I don't know why I didn't dive after him. Maybe part of me had been reached and folded by the fog already. Maybe I was afraid of what the lake would want to keep. Gavin's hand slipped from the rail and the water closed over his head. For a heartbeat, his face was a pale moon. Marcus screamed and tried to grab him, but he was shorter, weaker. His fingers met empty sleeve, and the blue hollow rocked with the force of our combined hysteria. Gavin's head broke the surface once, twice, like a stunned animal. His mouth opened, and there was the sound of someone trying to speak through a throat full of water. He looked at me. His eyes were wide and clearer than I ever wanted to see, and mouthed my name. In the fog, the word seemed to carry a life of its own. His hand slapped the water, and in that slap the face of the figure in the fog flickered, brief as film, like a reflection caught and then torn away. Then he was gone. The cold that hit me wasn't the October air. It came from under the deck, from the ribs of the boat, from the place where water remembers. I felt a pressure on my chest like a child's arms wrapped too tight. Marcus sobbed, an animal sound, and kept saying Gavin's name until it turned into a chant. I tried the engine again. The cord whipped and the motor coughed and wheezed and refused to wake. Our little star of a lantern flickered down to a stubborn ember and then steadied again as if it too were pacing itself against the dark. We did what people tend to do when a single explanation doesn't fit. We made plans that were soft and fragile. Marcus wanted to wait for other boats or for someone on shore to notice. I wanted to head in, to arrow toward the pier, to leave the fog behind like a bad taste. But without power and with visibility measured in the length of an outstretched arm, every decision felt like choosing between two knives. That's when the voice started up again. This time not only for me, it rose from the water like steam. It called names, but not ours. A litany of syllables that might have been old sailors, might have been people who had once loved places and been forgotten. They came in whispers and laughed with our own mouths. Marcus's face twisted. He covered his ears, but the sound slid into him anyway. It wasn't all hope. Some of those names were accusatory, some were grieving. All were intimate. The lake had a memory, and it liked the private ones best. Ancient currents, Eli Prescott later told me when the story to have a man who knew better explain it away. His wrinkled hands had an air of apology. Old wrecks, old bones, people who don't know how to leave. Once you hear a name out here, it can stick. The lake keeps what it wants. The problem with folklore is that it offers a vocabulary for fear without answering why fear chooses you. That night, Grand Traverse had chosen us like a child picking marbles. We drifted. Time slackened until it had the viscosity of molasses. At intervals, the fog parted slivers, and I could make out the silhouette of something enormous below the waterline, an upturned hull, a mass of timber like the shoulder of a fallen behemoth. The map I'd carried had a smudge where old charts marked a wreck, possibly the Mary B, and then indecipherable handwriting. If the Mary B had been a rumor in the town, it was a polite hush born of shame. Stories like that could be told, but they were always thinner where they met the water. My hands trembled as I reached into the tackle box for the rusted knife I'd used the week before to open a stubborn sandwich. The metal was cold, and a strangely solid thing amid the surreal. Gavin had always been the reckless one. He'd joke that fear was just excitement with better PR. I realized how naive that comment had been. Fear doesn't need PR. It shows up, uninvited, and moves furniture from rooms you thought you owned. Marcus swore he saw Gavin's silhouette under the fog once, far off, standing in waist-deep water, looking toward the shore. He reached and shouted, and the figure raised a hand. But when we steered closer, the water was smooth and untouched. Our perceptions were being cooked by something with infinite patience. The lake offered images like scraps to a starving animal. At some point between Marcus's sobbing and the tapping, I remembered what I'd been trying to escape from before this, all our small debts and big silences, and understood with a clarity that was oddly tender that the lake was not just taking bodies. It was drawing out the things you hide because water smooths edges. The whisper that called my name didn't just know it. It knew what I'd been told to forget. It unspooled secrets in syllables like hooks. Then the lantern went out. Darkness that is not just the absence of light, but an active presence crashed over us. In that total absence, I felt something touch the back of my neck again, fingers cool and purposeful. I swallowed and felt words rise in my throat that weren't mine. Marcus sobbed and vomited over the side. The smell was metal and something sweet I couldn't place. I thought of the stories about bodies that come up with coins on their eyes, about old men who kept ledgers of names and dates, and the lake that kept tally. There was a sound beneath the water like a choir tuning, and then a pressure against the hull as if a crowd were pressing their palms to a one-way window. For an instant, I had the clarity to see that whatever wanted Gavin wanted the living to remember him. It wanted us to be witnesses, to call his name into the dark and confirm that he had been real. Gav, I screamed, because what else do you do when the world asks you to prove something? The sound of my voice was small and raw. It bounced off the fog and came back layered with other sounds, voices overlaying voices, 1,000 small griefs singing in counterpoint. Hours later, if hours is a thing you can measure by that night, lights swelled in the fog like distant lantern festivals. Other boats answered ours with calls and flares, and there was the high, sharp keening of search teams with engines that seemed to cut the mist like a blade. Someone had finally seen that our little lantern had gone dark and tracked our sputtering radio signal. When rescuers finally found Blue Hollow, dawn was a rumor. We were 90 yards from the shore, nearer than we had any right to be. They hauled Gavin's jacket up from the water, torn and empty. There were no footprints on the wet rocks where he'd been pulled from our world. Marcus and I were dazed, mottled with cold and shame. I remember gripping the photographer's hand like a drowning man does a rail and being incoherent about trivialities. The lake gave us pieces of him. A watch frozen at 9:17, a shoe with a small hole in the seam, and a patch of water where the surface had a faint, oily swirl that refused to break. It did not give us Gavin's face. Afterward, townspeople clustered and exchanged stories, some with tenderness, some with the secretive chuckle of people who prefer tragedy as an eccentricity they can gossip about rather than a thing that could visit them. Eli brought his thermos and told us about men lost to the bay in winter storms. The pastor from town offered prayers that felt like Band-Aids, and someone in the bait shop muttered something about the Mary B being a ship that had carried men to their deaths for reasons that were complicated and human. I learned later that, unlike what we tell ourselves, the lake doesn't operate by moral calculus. It keeps what it likes, what it remembers, and sometimes it offers up pieces like tokens of its fancy. For nights after the rescue, I heard a name in my dreams, not my own this time, but Gavin's, faint, patient, and somehow still unfinished. I kept replaying the simple choices until they formed a litany. Go in, don't go in, pull him up, let the water take him, call for help, wait for someone to notice. Decisions are terrible in their finality, but in that fog they were a kind of grace, because each one became a shard of an answer I could hold. There are nights I lie awake and think I can hear the lake remembering me by name. The thing about places that hold memory is they require witnesses. They ship their relics out in tiny, cunning parcels so you'll know they were there. What I didn't understand then and still struggle to accept now is that some of those parcels are meant to make us look back, because the lake likes an audience. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The days after the rescue blurred into a kind of small public ritual. The sheriff, Landon Price, a thick-shouldered man with a soft undervoice, came by the hospital room and asked the questions that legal systems ask. Where were you? What did you see? Who touched whom? He treated trauma like paperwork. The coroner gave Gavin a cause of death that sounded tidy when you said it fast. Accidental drowning. Nobody accounted for the way the fog sounded, or for the whisper that said my name like a promise. Those details were not official things. They were the kind of truth that gets told in the corners where the light is dim. After I was let out, Ashfield Pointe found ways to be curious and perform condolence. There were casseroles and a councilman in a too-big suit saying the right words about grief and community. People asked how I was doing, as if asking could stitch anything back together. I answered with practiced phrases and smiled, because smiling is the same as surviving in front of others. I couldn't sleep. Sleep had become the place where the lake worked on me. My dreams were not cinematic so much as procedural, a sequence of small betrayals. The lantern goes out, a hand touches the deck, a voice says my name, then the water opens like a mouth. I woke with my clothes damp as if fog had followed me home. At first I blamed adrenaline and shock. Then the noises started. They began as small things. A soft tapping on my window like pelting rain, though it hadn't rained. The once-in-a-while slip of my name under the house's pipes when the heater kicked on. I would stand in the kitchen at 3 a.m. and swear I could hear water shifting under the floorboards. The town had a way of explaining these things. Old houses settling, pipes reacting to cold, but there was a rhythm to the noises that matched the tapping from the hull. Marcus moved away 2 weeks after the incident. He took a job 30 miles inland and called twice before I stopped answering. He said in one call, in a voice muffled by sudden shame, that he kept saying Gavin's name and it came back doubled. 2 voices answering him, one young, one dry as driftwood. He said the town was full of watchers now, people who loved the texture of disaster at a safe remove. He didn't want to be one of them. People expected me to carry on. I tried. I went back to work for a week and sat under fluorescent lights like a fossilized man. My boss patted my shoulder with an expression that meant, "We will not dwell," and slid a stack of invoices across my desk. I could go through motions, the rituals of payments and meetings, but everything else had the feel of paper towels over a spill. A useless pretense. One afternoon, lonely and reckless in ways I didn't yet name, I went back to the pier. The Blue Hollow had been hauled up and tied near a sagging dock, a small, shamed thing surrounded by fishermen's gossip. I wanted to touch wood. Touch is an honest kind of compulsion when words have failed you. It was there I met Grace Whitlow, historian, librarian, and the sort of woman who held town secrets like a second skin. She wore a thrift store sweater and 2 delicate silver rings, and the look of someone who had combed through other people's lives for a living. She'd been the person who'd called the rescue when a neighbor saw the lantern go dark and the fog swallowing everything. Grace had a knowledge about Grand Traverse the way some people have about their ancestry. She believed in facts and in the stories that facts made possible. "I read the old logs," she told me the first day we talked, while we watched the water breathe under a cold sun. "There are names that repeat. There's folklore, sure, but there's also a ledger at the Historical Society no one can quite explain." She brought over copies, ink faded to the color of tea. The Mary B, if that was what the old scrawl meant, had been a coastal freighter. The log entries were terse, dates, cargo, names. But on margins in a cramped, crabbed hand, there were lists, names crossed out and then rewritten. Beside some names, a small icon had been drawn over and over, a circle with a notch, like an eye with a key. The older pages smelled of salt and dust. One entry, written in an unsteady hand dated 1873, read, "Took boys to deeper water, couldn't turn 'em back. The bay keeps what it asks for." When Grace read that line aloud, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. People here knew. They just didn't say it in daylight. She looked at me like someone offering a frail bridge. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Her question was something I had been trying to articulate to myself in stolen moments. I nodded. The admissions slid out easier than I expected. It felt like opening a door that had been bolted for years. Grace gave me a look that held both pity and fierce, librarianly determination. A few days later, she brought me a brass compass she claimed had been pulled from the bay years ago. It was dented and the glass fogged. It had a name etched on the back, M. Hale, Marcus's name. The thing felt small and significant. She suggested gently that memory in Grand Traverse Bay often attaches to objects. "Artifacts carry attention," she said. "You carry what's still listening." What followed was a sequence of discoveries that looked from the outside like the neat arc of someone reaching for answers. I poked around the docks, talked to fishermen, sat in the bait shop, and let the hum of other people's lives drown me for a while. A man named Silas Crow, hard-faced with a laugh made of gravel, told me a story about the Mary B's captain, a man who kept a ledger of names because he believed the sea paid attention to accounts. "If you owe it, it will ask," Silas said. "Be careful what you sign away." The more threads I pulled, the more they braided together. I found a notebook, Gavin's, hidden in the lining of his jacket, filled with half-thoughts and drawings of the pier, a small map with an X by a bunch of rocks, and a single phrase repeated in shaky handwriting, "They want witnesses." There was a photograph tucked inside, a Polaroid of us on the Blue Hollow, laughing in daylight before the fog. On the back, in Gavin's blocky script, he'd written, "If anything, remember the light." That line came back to me at odd hours, echoing like a prayer. I kept thinking that the thing that had taken Gavin didn't only want body, it wanted to be seen. I wondered if that was a cruelty or a perverse kindness. It wanted confirmation. Yes, we were here. Yes, we saw. Yes, we remember. As the weeks blurred, the hauntings grew less like interruptions and more like a life threaded through mine. People who hadn't seen me in a while drew back as if they'd caught a scent of the lake clinging to me. I had moments of lucidity where I could touch grass and know the day simply. And then other moments, walking across the old pier when the fog rolled in, that felt like rehearsals for an act I hadn't agreed to be in. One night, 3 months after Gavin was taken, the fog returned in a heavier, more personal way. It pooled around my house like a pressed skirt. I could hear tapping on the glass again, soft, deliberate. My hands, traitorous things that wanted to be brave, opened the window. The sound stopped, then a voice, right in the room, said my name, and then another. Gavin's. And then a line of names I recognized from the ledger Grace had shown me. They were not accusations. They were a roll call, a remembering machine clicking through a list it had been charged to keep. I began to understand that Grand Traverse Bay was not an entity with human malice the way a villain is. It behaved like a ledger behaves, cold, indifferent, but with a strange arithmetic. It kept tally. It wanted witnesses. It demanded that someone speak aloud the names of those it took, perhaps so they could continue to exist in the world of telling. So I spoke. I started small at first, whispering names into the night when the fog swallowed streets and porches. Gavin's name tasted like a stone in my mouth, saying it didn't bring him back, saying it did something else. It loosened the knot in my chest, threaded my day with a small, tremulous permission to grieve. Those whispered names gathered me into a practice. People called it prayer. Others called it obsession. The more I named, the less the sound of my own name turned into a hook. The lake still called sometimes, always in the fog, always like a breath. But it felt less like an accusation and more like a memory that had found a voice. Even now, after the months and then the years, when the wind off the bay carries the right kind of salt in old coins, I will sit and say the names. Not because I believe water keeps a conscience, but because some things that happen to you want to be acknowledged. The bay taught me that, not gently, not mercifully. It taught me by taking a man who laughed too loud and giving me a silence in which to answer. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The last months of that year felt like a long, thin exhale. I kept living, which is its own kind of stubbornness, paying bills, answering calls, going to a job where fluorescent lights made my face like a flat photograph. But most of my hours were by a different metric, the pull of the bay. I went back to the pier more than anyone thought healthy. I spent afternoons with Grace at the Historical Society, tracing letters until ink bled into meaning, and late evenings at the bait shop, listening to whatever old men were willing to trade for a sugar donut. People like tidy endings. Accidents get neat coroner's reports and sympathy cards folded into envelopes. Lives, however, rarely align with neatness. What happened to Gavin did not. It left seams, half-visible stitches of things I did and didn't do. It left questions turning in the dark like gears in an engine. And the town kept calling it an accident because that word was easier to live with. But I had learned a different kind of truth on that water. Sometimes places don't take you because they hate you or because they need bodies. Sometimes they take you because they are repositories for loss and they want their ledger closed. Other times, more complicated, they take you because there's something wrong with the way people keep their accounts. A kind of moral arithmetic nobody quite understands. These are not reasons that make grief smaller. They are reasons that make grief meaningful. One late autumn day, Grace brought me a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a slim volume, a captain's log from 1872, brittle and faint. But bound to the back was a folded piece of what looked like sailcloth. On it, someone had stitched names in faint thread, each one a tiny knot. At the bottom, in a hand steady with intention, was the phrase, "Remember to return to shore." Some crews would bind a list, Grace said, voice low and precise. They're not always practical, Nathaniel. Sometimes it's superstition, sometimes it's owed attention. But the act of binding names together, it's a way of holding people in the world of the living. Maybe the bay listens to that. The thought lodged in me like a seed. If naming had soothed the way the bay called, perhaps there was something to ritual beyond superstition. I started to do small, quiet things that felt like repair. I collected names from faded obituaries, from the edges of town conversation, from Polaroids tucked in old jackets. I made a list, and then another, and then I learned the odd domestic art of saying names aloud in a voice steady enough that the fog couldn't distort them. But lists and whispers felt insufficient in the dark with the lake's memory. I wanted to look it in the face, if a lake could be said to have a face, and see whether the thing that had taken Gavin was an act of malice or a hunger that needed naming. I wanted to meet whatever had reached under our hulls and see if my witness could be more than a whisper. So one night in late winter, with ice forming like filigree on the pier posts and a moon like a coin over the bay, I took the blue hollow back out. The boat had been fixed, scrubbed, and tied as if guilt could be cleaned off with steel wool. Marcus hadn't joined me. He was a safer distance away now, living inland where water was a postcard. I called him the day before and left a message telling him I was going out again. He didn't answer. It was what I expected. Grace came with me, refusing at first, then conceding like someone who'd been deciding between fear and curiosity and chose both. She carried a lantern and the captain's log, the latter wrapped in brown paper as if paper could keep history from leaking. We pushed off into a night that felt thinner than the ones I remembered. The fog was lighter, more like breath than wool. The pier's light winked behind us and then winked out. We rowed slowly toward the spot I'd last felt the pressure on the hull. The water was nearly black, reflecting a moon that looked too sharp to be honest. Silence sat on us like the lid of a box. There were no other boats. Everyone in town wisely slept. The fog didn't come in waves this time. It hovered, a polite, expectant thing. When we reached the place, Grace opened the log and read. The words were simple: names, dates, short notations about cargo. Then, in an older hand, a sentence that seemed to be written for someone who would one day stand in this exact dark. If the bay keeps a balance, let the living be witness, and let the names be spoken together. We spoke them then, not a litany of the dead like a funeral rite, but names read with memory. Gavin Shaw, Thomas Crowell, Mary B. We followed the list in the log, and then the names I'd kept in my own rough book. We said them aloud until the syllables pooled around our ears and the fog held them. Grace's voice, steady and clear, braided with mine. It felt absurdly to be delivering a roll call, a census for the other side of things. When we reached Gavin's name, everything changed. The fog tightened, not malevolent but attentive, as if the water leaned closer to hear someone speak the exact sound of what it had taken. There was a tug at the boat, gentle at first, then like an old hand closing on wood. The lantern swung and threw diamond shapes across the waves. For a moment I thought I would see him. Gavin, blinking, sopping, laughing at the fact that we'd spent months naming him like a prayer. Instead, something else surfaced. An object, dull and green with age, bobbing in the water. Grace steadied the lantern while I reached for it with gloved hands. It was a watch, exactly the one they'd found at the rescue, the one that had stopped at 917. Only this one had a small smear of something on the back, like dried paint. Underneath, etched into the casing in a hand that was not machine-made but was careful, was a new name carved later. Finer. Gavin Shaw. I held it up. The fog bit at the light and then let it pass. Grace whispered something about tokens and the way water returns what it's finished with. I thought of the times I'd clung to the submerged outlines of a man I couldn't find. Seeing the watch felt like being given a small, stubborn proof that our world and the bays were in communication. The air shifted then, subtly at first, and I heard, not as a voice, but as an implication, the thankful murmur of being remembered. The lake is not kind, it is not cruel, it is an enormous, patient ledger that favors nothing but its own rules. What we offered that night, names spoken into the dark, felt like an act of attention that the bay accepted. It did not undo the fact of Gavin's absence. It didn't hand him back in the way movies do. But it folded a small corner of the world back toward us. We returned to shore in the dark, the watch wrapped in Grace's scarf. The pier creaked under our boots like a tired animal. People in town would later tell themselves we had been lucky or imaginative, that the watch had been caught on a current, or that memory had stitched coincidences into meaning. Some will always prefer the tidy answer. Time moved. Spring came and melted the edges of the lake that had seemed so absolute in winter. The fog still comes in, and sometimes on hot, wet nights I can hear a name like a small bell. But the call is different for me now. It is softer, like an old song I know the chorus to. I still say names. I still keep lists. I still go out occasionally with a lantern and a log and someone who will bear witness. It is my way of insisting the ledger be read aloud, not tucked away in the dark. Gavin is not here. He is, I think, in the same place as the men and women the bay keeps, folded into the great slow accounting of the water. I live with that not because I have learned to forgive the lake, but because the world teaches you how to live with losses by turning them into responsibilities. I tell the story because, if nothing else, Telling is a way to keep things balanced. It is my witness. If you ever come to Grand Traverse Bay on an October night and the fog decides to lean in, do not assume malice. Listen. Say the names you'd keep in your pocket. Call them aloud. You might find, as I did, that the worst things do not always want to take away entirely. Sometimes they only demand to be seen. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Logan Price. I was 28 years old. The night everything changed was October 14, 2018. I tell this not to brag or seek sympathy, but because details matter. Dates, places, faces. When you try to pin down a thing that refuses to be pinned. Grand Traverse Bay is beautiful in the fall. Cold, silver water and a wind that sharpens voices into private, urgent truths. I grew up near the eastern shore in a town that should have been sleepy but hummed with small-town urgencies. Boat repairs, late-night diner coffee, the chatter of fishermen swapping tall tales when the lake was too angry to fish. My father had taught me to read the weather by the way gulls flew. My mother had taught me to listen to people the way you listen to the lake, patient, ready to catch the sudden ripple that means something deeper. Before that October, my life was ordinary enough to be unremarkable. I worked as a night mechanic at Sutton Works Marina. We did trailers, outboards, and sometimes the odd restoration for a retiree who wanted to keep his old Chris Craft looking young. My best friend was Mason Brooks, who could make anyone laugh by turning a simple story into a punchline, and he owned a little bait and tackle shop on the main strip. There was also Avery Cole, who owned the Cedar and Lantern, a coffee and oddities place where local fishermen left lost mittens and readers left dog-eared books. We all knew each other, the kind of people who nodded in passing and called each other by name without thinking of the extra meaning a name carries. That year, there had been talk of early storms. The weather reports whispered about a cold front moving in from the north. The newsroom anchorwoman mentioned sustained winds and unpredictable gusts between commercials. My boss, Hank, was an old salt who treated the marina like his ship. "Lock everything down by sundown," he said that Friday, tapping his cigarette against an ashtray with a kind of ritualistic solemnity. Lake doesn't forgive dumb mistakes. He'd been right twice before. He'd rebuilt 2 boats after storms that came out of nowhere. I was the kind of guy who liked routine but trusted intuition. Routine had me locking the east gate that evening, checking lines on Mystic, a 62-footer with a temperamental starter, and making sure the tarps were tied neat enough to survive a gale. Intuition told me to call my sister and check in. She lived downstate, because there's a certain tension in the way the sky looks when it's about to spit out cold rain. I called Mason to remind him to secure his shop. We joked because that's what we did to keep nervousness small. We spun it into something lighter. People talk about the supernatural like it's a separate thing, a hooded figure, a creak in an empty house, a whisper in a hallway. But for me, the rare and the uncanny had always been built from ordinary pieces. A misplaced glove, a shadow that shifts when you look away, the way a familiar voice says one word wrong and you keep listening for the rest of the sentence. The bay had its own small unexplainables. Boats sometimes drifted in on mornings with their radio still playing. Chairs on porches were found facing the wrong way after a storm. There was an abandoned boathouse near Marshfield Cove that local kids swore was haunted because their flashlights always started to die when they went near it. None of that was dramatic, just the sort of things you'll chalk up to wind or poor batteries and then mention at a cookout for a laugh. What made that October different was a confluence of small things. A not quite right weather report, Hank's cigarette smoke voice saying, "Lock everything," and a note on the marina bulletin board about a private charter tug coming through at dusk. The note had a name I didn't recognize. The captain was listed as Royce Voss, with a contact number and a terse instruction to meet at 5 Mile Point. The number was scratched in black, and someone had circled it twice as if to make sure the ink didn't wander off the paper. Royce Voss. The name sounded like the kind the lake hands traded in with a nod, mysterious enough to be interesting, ordinary enough not to be threatening. There were other characters, too. Pastor Len, who ran a tiny church on the bluff, and Mrs. Hargrove down on Wren Street, who always handed out lemon bars at the fall festival. There was a new face, a woman who'd moved into the small duplex by the docks, painting her front stairs a bold teal. She waved when I locked the gate. People liked her, or at least they were curious. Everyone had a story. Some were short, some were half-told and jagged. I'd been in enough trouble to know when to keep secrets and when to speak. There was one secret I'd been holding that summer, a debt of silence I owed myself. I'd seen something as a kid on a night like that, a boat gliding slow and too soft across water that should have been white with foam. It made no sound. It had no name. My father had told me to forget it. Some things aren't worth the weight of words, Logan, he'd said, and that was good advice for a while. But secrets have a way of getting loud when the world wants to be quiet. So when Royce Voss's name showed up on the board, it landed on some old sore. Not superstitious fear, but a prickling of attention. I thought maybe I'd go down to 5 Mile Point if Royce needed help hauling something in. Maybe Hank would put me on standby for the tug. Being useful felt like armor. Offering muscle to a stranger felt like being part of the town's soft machinery. Mason said I was being foolish when I mentioned it over beers, but his grin had a shadow under it, the way friends get veiled about things that bother them too. By dusk, a low, thick cloud bank moved over the water like a lid. The sky went the color of dishwater, then darker. A few tourists hurried past the boardwalk, collars up, cameras tucked away. The gulls had already moved inland to the garbage bins, squabbling. Hank tapped the bulletin again before the marina lights muted into life. If the tug's late, somebody will have to check on it, he said. He said it like a statement, not a question. The kind of small command that comes from knowing how the town spins. I told myself I was going to 5 Mile Point for the work. I told myself I was going to watch, keep an eye, be part of the safety net. Those were half-truths. There's a certain pull to seeing how a story begins, especially when it smells faintly of secrets. I was about to find out how stories can change once you step toward their center. The main story begins on the path down to the shoreline, where the wind had learned to speak like someone with something urgent to say. The smell was of salt and the small metallic tang of coming rain. I had my flashlight, Hank's old oilskin jacket, and a pocket full of coins for the payphone I never thought I'd use. The dock creaked underfoot. The water looked wide and patient, and for the first time that night, I noticed how a thing can feel watched, even when there is nothing visible to watch with. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The wind had turned into a conversation by the time I reached 5 Mile Point. Not friendly small talk, but one of those brisk, urgent exchanges that leaves you hollering to be heard. The path to the point cut between low, scrubby pines and a strip of marsh where cattails shivered like a dozen frail sentinels. My flashlight beam skittered over driftwood and old mooring rings. Somewhere a dog barked, hard and sudden, then went quiet. The tug I'd read about on the board should have been easier to see than it was. The harbor lights were small and stubborn in the distance, but the shape against the horizon that could have been a ship was curiously mute. Then a horn bellowed, low and old-fashioned, like a cough from something with a long history of keeping secrets. It sounded once, then twice, a measured rhythm that made me look like a child expecting thunder. Royce Voss stepped out from behind a cluster of pilings with a raincoat pulled tight and a cap that matched the creases in his face. He was lean and older than I guessed from the name on the board. His hands were the kind a man gets from decades of working with ropes and metal, knuckled and steady. He squinted at me like he was trying to place a face he'd seen in a photograph years ago. "You Logan?" he asked. His voice had a rasp like gravel. "Yeah, Logan Price." I told him my name like an offering, like hands searching for something steady. "Hank told me you were stopping by. I thought you might need an extra pair of hands." He nodded once, brief. "Good. You from Sutton Works?" "Been freelancing there. Night shifts." I kept my answers short because small talk felt wrong on a night that wanted to be serious. Royce motioned toward the tug, its silhouette a hulking, patient thing, its deck lights pinpricks in the dark. A small skiff, not more than a tender, rocked beside it, tied with a line that looked brand new. The tug itself had a nameplate that was half browned by salt and time. I couldn't make out the letters. "You coming aboard?" he asked. There was an edge to the question I didn't like. The kind of edge that meant choices had weight, and every choice had consequences. Still, I climbed the ladder. The deck smelled of diesel and old rope. The captain moved with the kind of economy that comes from knowing where every part of your world starts and ends. He introduced me to a man with a scar that ran like a punctuation mark across his jaw, a quiet man named Ellis who kept to the wheel and watched the water the way a preacher watches a scripture. The three of us stood with the tug between us and the open bay, and the world felt small and legitimate. Royce told us they were late because a barge coming up from the southern channel had lost its anchor in a storm earlier that week. It had been carrying something small and heavy. Equipment, he said, not the kind of cargo that made a town talk. There was a look he gave the bow, like a man who was trying to steady himself against an old worry. "We're taking her in to offload," he said. "Private work. Someone's been asking about an old case." Mason had texted me once when I left town, a single word: careful. He'd been worried about the tug and about the weather and about how I sometimes treated curiosity like armor. I hadn't replied. There was a night work rhythm, a comfortable silence interrupted by the creak of lines and the thump of the engine as we pushed toward shore. The closer we got, the more the sounds of the town changed. Traffic faded, and the bay made a sound like the inside of a huge, hollow instrument. We made it to a small cut near Marshfield Cove, where the barge was supposed to have drifted. What marked the place was less visible than felt. The water seemed to hold its breath there. Ellis hailed down into the fog and then dropped the anchor with a clank. When they threw a floodlight over the side, the beam found something half sunken and half holding onto its last dignity. A dinghy, upside down, its name long scraped from the transom. A child's rubber duck, yellow and chipped, bobbed at the lip of a submerged life jacket like a foolish bright eye. I said nothing then because speech felt like a trespass. Royce climbed down with a line and a pair of hooks. "This is odd," he muttered. The dinghy had no registration plates, no markings, only a crude scratch that looked like a letter or maybe a tally. He tied it to the tug and we began the slow work of hauling it into the light. When the dinghy cleared the water, the smell hit me. Not just salt and diesel, but something older and fouler, like the breath of things that had been kept underwater for too long. There were scrapes along the hull, the kind made by stones or by desperate fingers. In the bilge, caked and remarkable in its ugliness, was a single shoe, a small sneaker green with age, the size a child might have worn. It had laces knotted with impatience. I thought of the duck and felt a coldness move along my spine, not because I was thinking of death yet, but the world had shifted to a setting where small things mean larger things. Royce swore softly and radioed someone down the line. The words were clipped and professional. "We need the sheriff, and we need transport." Sheriff Nolan Briggs was at the marina within an hour, his cruiser lights dull and respectful in the dark. He was a good sheriff, older, with a face that had learned to carry both gravity and the small human kindness it takes to keep a town's secrets from shredding its people. He took one look at the dinghy and the shoe and asked questions that were careful and legal and humane. "Any sign of a name?" he asked. "Anything that says who this belonged to?" "No names," Royce said. "Just an ugly little tally. Could be a years-old wreck. Could be something recent." We talked while the tide tried to pull our words out to sea. Mrs. Hargrove's lemon bars were mentioned in connection with a missing boy from 2 decades earlier. A name I knew only from the way older townsfolk folded into sad smiles when they said it. Pastor Len came down with a thermos of something hot, and his hands trembled when he offered mugs. People in small towns take an absence and give it the weight of many words. They do it because it helps to make something unfinished into something that will be looked after. Sheriff Briggs radioed for a dive team and sent word to the county. They worked with the methodical patience of people trained to find evidence among the indifferent and indifferent among the found. I waited because that was what I did. I kept vigil in the way my family had taught me, watchful, present, trying to be useful. Royce offered a cigarette, and I refused. Tobacco felt too close to ritual. The tug's lights hummed and cast our shadows long and thin like stretched photocopies. When they finally brought the bilge up, it held more than the shoe. Wrapped in a tarpaulin was an old letterbox, rusted but intact. Someone had set a padlock on it that was new and heavy. The padlock was scratched with the same odd tally, a mark that looked almost like a series of tally marks run together. Royce's face went pale, not the kind of pale you get from a shock of wind, but the kind that comes when a man recognizes a phrase he's tried to forget. "You know that mark?" I asked, because, in truth, I did. It matched a mark I'd seen as a kid near the old boathouse, a graffiti-like scratch that some of the boys had carved into the dock and swore was nothing more than boredom. I'd called it childish vandalism then, and had never thought it would resurface in a shipping manifest of something heavier. Royce nodded, his jaw clenched. "We used to see it sometimes," he said. "Out on the north side. Didn't mean anything, not then." The sheriff's team took the box and the lock. They asked us to go home, to give space while the forensics did what they would do. I should have gone. I should have driven back to the little duplex where the teal house sat with its bravely painted steps. I should have called Mason, but something kept me on the pier, like gravity made of curiosity. I wanted to watch the way things unfolded. I wanted to be present at the edge of a thing that had teeth. As we climbed back onto the tug to warm ourselves, Ellis tapped the deck with his boot and said something that seemed small at first and then larger. "You ever get the feeling, Logan," he said, "that the lake doesn't let go of things it's chewed on?" I thought of my father's words, "Some things aren't worth the weight of words," and understood in a way that made my throat tight. The bay had held something that night, and it had finally given it back. Whatever the padlock hid would tell a story. Whatever story it told would make someone's private weight visible in a way they could not ignore. We left the tug and the sheriff busy with paper and hypotheses. The wind had sharpened into a wind that wants to tell you something in the language of a shorebound night. I walked away thinking of small shoes and rubber ducks, and the way a town gathers around a secret as though it knows the outline of grief before it knows the name. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The next morning, the town seemed to be holding its breath in the way small places do when something unspeakable has edged into their calendar. The county dive team had taken the box and the padlock, and Sheriff Nolan Briggs had a way of looking at you that meant he wanted to protect you from truths before you were ready for them. He thanked me for sticking around, but his eyes said what his mouth wouldn't. Stay clear of whatever this was. I tried to do that. I tried to go back to my normal rhythms, to sweep the slips of grease off my hands and pretend the bay had been nothing more than a place that threw up a single shoe. But curiosity has teeth. It gnawed. By noon, the town was a quiet hum of whisper and rumor. Old cases reopened, names revisited that folks had thought archived into polite silence. The sheriff's deputy mentioned, in a tone meant to be casual, that the padlock matched a set of tags found years ago near the old boathouse on North Cove. The same tally mark scratched into metal, 3 jagged strokes joined by a crooked slash. The mark had a nickname in the kids' language, the Fork, and kids remember crooked things like talismans. I couldn't stand the thought of the boathouse out of reach. It had been a childhood landmark, half boardwalk, half legend. We dared each other to go inside when we were small, the way boys dare each other near any place adults warn them away from. I remember the boards that sucked at your sneakers and the smell of oil and fish guts, and one time, when I was 10, someone had scratched that same mark into the rafters with a pocket knife. I'd always thought it was nothing more than vandalism. I hadn't known to keep it in the corner of my head like a key. Royce had been quieter since the sheriff took the box. He kept to himself in the marina office, hands busy with manifests and paper like he could pin sense to the world if he kept his fingers in it. Ellis stopped coming into town in the afternoons. He was a man who seemed to read the water and decide it knew more than he did. Mason tried to make jokes about the whole thing when I stopped by the bait shop, but his laugh was short and brittle. "You shouldn't be poking around, man," he said, half to me and half to the fluorescent light over the counter. Some things rot for a reason. But the town's rot had a way of smelling like truth. Sheriff Briggs called a press summary late in the afternoon. The box hadn't contained a body, the public was told, which seemed to be both reassurance and an invitation to darker imaginings. Forensics had found a few items inside: a waterlogged journal, a child's crayon with the wrapper gone, and a Polaroid photograph whose edges had fuzzed in the salt and time. The photograph showed a small boy wearing a baseball cap and grinning with a gap where a tooth should have been. In the corner of the photo, faint and like a scar left by a careless hand, was the tally mark. Sheriff Briggs asked that anyone who recognized the boy or who knew more about the old boathouse to come forward. The Polaroid sat in my mind like something that needed matching. I went back to the boathouse before the sun went fully down. The path there was narrower than I remembered, lined with grass that had softened into a sort of damp gray. My flashlight showed me the boards like lines on a palm, the pattern of old weather. The place smelled like the underside of boats: oil, mildew, and a faint sweetness that could be old paper. The boathouse door was unlatched, as if someone had opened it and left it ajar for years. Inside, the light found old nets, a rusted winch, and a row of lockers, each with its own rusty padlock. Near the rafters was the mark carved into the wood, 3 jagged strokes and a slash. And for a heartbeat, I was 10 again, feeling like I'd found a secret that would make me brave. I ran my fingers over the carved wood and felt splinters, the way the past lodges under your skin. I found a locker slightly ajar, the padlock gone. Inside there were clippings, yellowed newspapers folded into themselves like old letters, and a child's name repeated across them in sad print: Michael Langley. Every headline was a memory gathered into a single thin paper: local boy missing, spring 1996. Another clipping mentioned an inquest, a line in a paragraph about search parties braving the marsh, the dates pinned like arrows. I'd heard that name in the town's undercurrent of memory, the one many older folks guarded like something private and fragile. I felt a pull like an animal scent and realized the Polaroid on the tug's desk could have been him. There was a shoebox in the back of the locker. Inside it lay a small brass key on a chain, dull with water and salt, but stamped, faint, but the mark was there. 3 strokes and a slash. I held the key and felt the world tilt. Whoever had locked something away in the padlock, whoever had branded it with that crooked tally, had been keeping a secret with the same insistence as an old town keeps its saints behind glass. I took the key and the clippings to Pastor Len, because some things you feel you should hand over to someone who can hold sorrow without breaking it. He sat in the church with the afternoon light like a benediction across the pews and listened without interrupting. He folded his hands and said the right words: about grief, about the town, about memory. But there was something in his face that made me ask the question I'd been avoiding. Why had nobody ever found Michael? Pastor Len sighed and told me what town memory had whispered but never shouted. There had been rumors then that some folks had seen the child near the old jetty, that boys had been dared to pull the rowboat out of the cove, that an argument between 2 men had been noticed and not pursued. People close ranks, Pastor Len said gently, not always to protect the guilty, sometimes to protect themselves. That night, my duplex felt wrong. I parked in the driveway and noticed the teal woman, Lila Green, on her stoop, knitting in the dark with a porch light on like a beacon. She looked up when I came near and smiled, and it felt both warm and fragile. "You should let it go," she said quietly when I told her the main details. "Towns like ours, they have long memories for short things, Logan. This will pull at other threads." Her voice had a weight I admired. She wore a silver ring on her thumb with an image of a small star. It caught the light like an accusation. I sat up that night thinking of keys and Polaroids, of locks and tally marks. I thought of Royce's face when the padlock had been shown to him, how his hands had trembled when he saw the mark. I thought of Ellis, who watched water like it told the future, and of old men and their cigarettes and apologies they didn't know how to make. There was a pattern that wanted to be seen, and it had eyes. Sometime before dawn, I woke to the sound of my truck's horn, a single, rude bleat that made me slide out of bed as if water had been poured down my spine. I ran outside and found everything the same at first glance. The quiet street, Mrs. Hargrove's curtains drawn, but then my chest tightened. Someone had been in my garage. My toolbox was open, my custom wrench set the way I kept it, and the box that held my father's old compass was missing. A compass is a small, private thing. It points, and you follow it, or you get lost. The loss of the compass felt like a message. Someone wanted me to know they had been in my life in the small hours. On the kitchen table was a scrap of paper, wet along the edges as if it had been left near the water. 3 jagged strokes joined by a crooked slash. I understood then, in a hollow place under my ribs, that curiosity had a price. Someone who recognized the mark, who knew where keys and padlocks and old secrets lived, was watching. They wanted whatever lay in the padlock to stay closed, or to be found by the right hands first. Either way, I wasn't sure I could step back. So I went back to the boathouse with the brass key in my pocket and the town's old hush at my heels. The sun was a thin coin in the gray. The locker where the key had been found smelled of mildew and old pages. I slid the key into the lock on one of the oldest trunks in the corner, the lock with the newish padlock still warm from the sun and clever with a fresh bite of rust. The key turned with a sound like an honest thing being opened, and inside were more photographs. One of them, a Polaroid of a small boy grinning, baseball cap askew. He looked right at me, as if summoned. There was also a folded note, the ink run but the handwriting clear in a way that made stomach acid lift. It said only, in a hurry, "If you're reading this, some people will come for you. Trust nobody who wears a cap. Find Royce before they do." I heard then, more felt than heard, a footstep behind me on the boardwalk outside. Slow, deliberate, the kind that knows the rhythm of planks and wants to be noticed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The footsteps stopped just behind me, a soft, patient thing that matched the creak of the boards. I hadn't heard another set of steps, which meant whoever was there knew how to move on wood the way some people know how to move through water. I turned slowly, the brass key cold against my palm, the Polaroids I'd tucked under my jacket like hot coals. Royce stood in the doorway, cap in hand, rain light on his shoulders. For a second, I couldn't read his face. He had that look of a man who'd been up with the tide and had seen things he didn't want to put into words. Then his jaw set. "You shouldn't have come back," he said quietly. There was the faint smell of diesel and the sweeter tang of fear. "They don't like keys being found." "Who are they?" I asked. The key felt heavier. The town, I'd learned, had layers, the kind that fold and keep what they hide very close. Royce's eyes searched the rafters like a man reading lines in a scripture. "Men who wear caps and own docks," he said finally. "Men who have money to fix inconvenient problems. People I used to trust and people I never thought could do what they did." He told me then, while the light in the boathouse turned the dust into a kind of slow snow, the part of the story no clipping could hold. The padlocked box had been a ledger once, not a book for boats, but an accounting of favors and payments. It named men who paid not for lumber or rope, but for quiet. It had recipes of barter and darkness, old photographs, the names of boys who disappeared from the edge of the bay, shorthand notes about times and tides. Royce had hauled it up years ago, he said, and hid it because he couldn't bear what it showed. Then someone else had insisted it be hidden more carefully. The tally mark, the fork, was the sign of the men who kept accounts with human life. I remember feeling like the floor had become a raft and the raft was turning. This wasn't the airy myth we'd laughed about as kids at the dock. It was deliberate and dreadful. "Why me?" I asked. "Why hide it in a trunk at the boathouse and then leave a key?" "Because somebody wanted someone to find it when the tide was right," Royce said. "Because they thought they could choose who found it. Because they wanted to lure the curious and make examples." He looked at me with the kind of pity that doesn't come easily. "You were never meant to open it, Logan. But now that you have..." Footsteps answered us from outside, 3 pairs, close and slow. They carried the smell of cheap tobacco and the certainty of men who believe money absolves them. Royce moved first, and even then I didn't have time to think about what was right. He shoved the trunk toward the darker corner and wrapped me in a motion that was almost tenderness. "Run to the bluff," he said. "Find the old radio there. Get someone who doesn't wear a cap." I ran because the world had narrowed to the sound of wood against my soles and the sharp breath of the night. Behind me there was shouting, the slap of a hand on a door, the heavy thud of a man gone wrong. I got to the bluff and found the radio, an old hand crank the town used for storms, and I turned its dials with hands that wouldn't steady. Mason answered on the third try, voice thick with sleep and dry with worry. I told him where to go and to whom to call without explaining too much. I told him to get Sheriff Briggs and the state police if he could. When I ran back, the men were there, sleeves rolled, caps low, faces like bad weather. They hadn't expected Royce to be stubborn. They found him by the trunk, trying to lock the lid again with a wrench and a muttered curse. The first man struck him hard across the face. Royce went down near the old winch, blood raining into the grain. He looked up at me as if the world had become a very small stage for one final act. "What's in it?" one of the men asked, voice coarse with entitlement. Royce coughed and spat salt, and then said something I'll never forget. "Names, pictures, proof." He smiled then, a small, exhausted thing. You won't like being famous for the wrong thing. The men moved as if to finish it. I lunged because I was a young man with nothing to lose and a compass missing from my pocket, and no sense of the cleverness of caution. I felt the world in an adrenaline blur. A chair knocked, a bucket overturned. I remember Mason's voice cutting through the noise like a saw. "State police, don't move." Sheriff Briggs came through the open door like a man who'd been carved out of duty, and behind him came blue lights and the smell of answers. It turned out the men had a name: Clifton Creel, owner of Creel & Son Trawlers, and two partners who'd been good to the town in public and worse in private. Royce had written their names in the ledger, priced and noted. He'd kept the box because he believed he could live with the secret. Then he realized secrets like that metastasize. The ledger, soggy in parts but legible where ink had survived, had been proof enough for a warrant. State detectives arrived and, with the kind of slow, awful ceremony truth sometimes brings, made arrests. We learned more later. Payments, matchbooks with dates, the way small favors had become monstrous habits. Men who'd been pillars of the harbor were taken away in handcuffs that gleamed like new shackles. The town held its breath, and then it began to exhale through tears and funerals and apologies that sometimes came too late. Michael Langley's name, the gap-toothed boy in the Polaroid, became a hinge on which a dozen memories swung open. Creel & Sons files revealed outings, parties, boats booked under odd names. The ledger didn't solve everything. The lake still kept some of what it has consumed, but it broke the surface enough to let light in. Royce didn't come back to Sutton Works. He went home that night, and the bruise in his face turned into a long bruise of something that wouldn't heal right. He told me later, in a voice that sounded older than his years, that the ledger's truth had cost him the only thing he was sure of, his peace. He disappeared from town within the year, taking the sea like it was a refuge and leaving behind a note for me that read, simply, "Do better with the light." There were consequences no one could have hoped to avoid. Some men left and never returned. Some families broke and tried to cobble themselves back together like sailors repairing a hull. Mason sold the bait shop and moved to an industrial job 3 cities away. Lila closed her teal house and took a teaching position 50 miles off. Pastor Len started a memorial fund and began a small program for kids who needed safe havens. Sheriff Briggs, who had long since carried the town on his conscience, retired with a weight finally halved. For me, the price was quieter, but permanent. I kept the brass key for a while and then hid it in a drawer where old things go to wait. I couldn't ever quite stand the water the same way. Nights were longer, and sometimes when the wind came from the bay, it sounded less like a conversation and more like a chorus of things calling names. I told fewer secrets after that because I'd learned how much of a town can be stitched together with silence, and how dangerous that stitching can be when it's meant to hold shame, not cover wounds. Michael never came home in a way the town could bring him back whole. What we found was pieces of a story and, more importantly, names that could be made to face justice. For some, that was enough. For others, nothing would ever be. I tell you all this because the lake shows you 2 choices. You can let the water keep what it swallows, or you can try to pull at the blanket it tucks over the truth. Both choices cost. Both demand courage. I chose to pull. Years later, walking the boardwalk with the sun low over Grand Traverse Bay, I still sometimes think about the child's rubber duck bobbing at the edge of a dinghy, and about the way a town can either bury its uncomfortable truths in the dark or bring them into the light. We did both. We made mistakes. We also learned that small people can do big things when they stop keeping secrets in the name of comfort. If you ever hear the name The Fork, don't laugh it off as graffiti. Names stick to things for a reason, and if you ever find a key in a dusty locker, don't mistake it for a trinket. Sometimes it's an invitation. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Blackwood. I was 29 years old on June 14th, 2018, when the thing happened in Grand Traverse Bay that rewired how I think about lakes, light, and the quiet places between one heartbeat and the next. If you ask me to tell that night straight, I'll fumble. Memory keeps heirs and debts. It gives me pieces and withholds the rest. So let me lay the table first, like a storyteller should. Introduce the people, the place, the weather of the soul before the weather of the water. You'll have time to breathe in the small details. They matter. They are the tinder that made a single spark seem like a blaze. Port Wren was the sort of town people said they wanted when they read novels set on forgotten coasts. Narrow Main Street, a single red diner that smelled of coffee and caramelized onions, a hardware store that also sold fishing lures and county gossip. The bay itself, Grand Traverse Bay, is wide and patient, a long arm of Lake Michigan that curls north and south like an old man's hand. Locals talk about the bay as if it's a person you must keep on nodding terms with, feed it fish, respect its moods, never leave a child unattended near its edge. I grew up 2 towns over, but I lived in Port Wren the summer of that year, renting a second-floor room above an antique shop run by June Whitaker. June is small and quick with a laugh that starts in her throat and climbs into her eyes. She knows when you need coffee and when you need a lie. She'd known my father, the kind of man who salted herring and lied about how long he'd been at sea. June had a grandson named Rhett Cooper. Not my grandson, her grandson, who worked nights at the marina and carried a coil of rope like a talisman. Rhett and I were friends the way boys from small towns are friends. We shared beer, a distrust of the county sheriff's politics, and the kind of wordless loyalty that ends in you fetching someone from the ditch at 3 a.m. There was also Marla Sayers, who taught me to read tide patterns like a lover reads a face. She was a volunteer at the Lighthouse Museum and would show visitors a faded photograph of her father in a Navy uniform. Deputy Ben Klein rounded out our little circle. Steady, broad-shouldered, wore his badge on the inside of his skin more than on his chest. Each person had their history of lost nets and lost loves. We were all ornately practical in our stoicism. That June, the air tasted like iron and new leaves. The lake had been too warm for June. Fishermen muttered that the thermocline felt wrong. We had jokes about the weather being confused. Even the clouds can't make up their minds, people said. But jokes are often a way to barter with fear. The town calendar was full of small occasions. The annual harbor cleanup, an art fair where quilts hung like bright boats on clotheslines, the Lighthouse Open House. I was 30 by the calendar that year, but I still felt 29. The specific age I tell you now because memory insists on exactness for the night it remembers best. Why was I out on the bay that night? Safer to say, necessity, mixed with pride. I'd taken a summer job driving a small tour skiff for visitors who wanted to see the North Arm Lighthouse up close. The skiff, Maggie's Pride, belonged to a man named Tommy Grayson, who had hands like softened rope and a laugh like sea glass clinking in a jar. Tommy was a good skipper, not showy, careful in a way that would make his grandmother proud. He trusted me enough to let me steer, and I trusted myself enough not to ruin the trust. The boat ran quiet and low, motor burbling in its comfortable rhythm. We carried 5 passengers. 2 art students from the city, Marla, she came out to show a young class a real lighthouse, Rhett, because the marina never had enough hands, and an older couple who wanted pictures of the bay at dusk. I remember how the sun began to bruise the west, how gulls argued over a silver fish, how the lighthouse stood at its usual stubborn angle against the sky. You must know that Grand Traverse Bay has moods, and the day had been a sly one. All week the weather feed had shown a stalled front offshore. The papers called it a microstorm pattern, nothing to panic over. Men who've been on water for 50 years still double-check radios and pull on raincoats twice. We had a weather alert on the marina board the day before, but it was the sort of alert you slide your thumb over and say, later. Port Wren teaches you to treat killing winds like coyotes. Keep your door locked and don't tempt them. Character introductions and setting out of the way, let me tell you now the small human things. The joke Rhett told that made Marla snort into her camera, the way Tommy hummed a hymn he couldn't quite remember, how the older woman, Evelyn, said she could smell her mother's pies when she looked at the waves. Detail holds the scene together. The things I list now are scaffolding. The main structure will shift, but without these planks, the house of the story would fall. The bay had been a stage long before us. It keeps stories like a ledger. There were whispered tales. Fishermen spoke of currents in the North Arm that would take a boat as swiftly and silently as a closed hand. Stories about a shoal that smelled of old pennies and the way fog would sometimes roll in and play tricks with depth. Grand Traverse Bay doesn't frighten people the way the ocean does. It frightens them with intimacy, with the way it suggests that the edge of the known world is merely a breath away. I wanted you to see the town before you saw the water exacting its price. You need the faces. You need the small human loyalties. You need the idea that we were ordinary. Ordinary is the point. Terrible things like to visit ordinary people because the contrast makes them sharper, more obscene. It was past 7 when we cast off. The lighthouse winked as its keeper turned on the old Fresnel lens for the evening. Our course hugged a shallow crescent where tourists could disembark at a salt-rimed jetty. For the first 7 minutes, the world was the sort of beautiful we bank memories in. Golden light, the smell of diesel and rain, the low, content chatter of people who had seen other things and were content to be small toward the end of the day. Then the wind changed its mind. I don't mean a playful gust, I mean something exact and abrupt, as if the sky had been reading one script and someone had set it down and typed in another. The first change was a sound. A high, hard fret on the roof of the world. We thought it odd and pulled closer to the lighthouse, not yet alarmed. Tommy cursed under his breath and glanced at the barometer. None of us had a blueprint for what came next. The sun slid faster, the light went from honey to a flat, quick gray, and the lake, the Trader Lake, began to frown. That's where the main story starts, where the trivialities and the kindnesses and the small-town jokes fall away and leave room for the kind of decisions that never look like themselves until you must make them. The boat's bow rose, and then the world did a thing that people who love water tell you is impossible. The surface cracked into a language we couldn't read, and beneath the sentences, something larger pushed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The bow slammed down, and the world answered with a sound that wasn't wind or water so much as a low, offended animal. 1 second we were skimming. The next, the lake reached up like a hand and punched us. I remember the taste of salt and diesel and the sharp, stupid thought that this would be the last time I would ever be near anything that felt warm. Tommy swore, a short, clean sound. He fought the wheel with 2 hands, but the skiff, light as it was, behaved like a thing that had been given new mischief. The waves came quick and rude, and between them the water seemed to bulge, a ripple that didn't match the rest. It wasn't the way storms move, not the rolling argument of wind. This felt sapient, an irritation concentrated in a single place, a throat clearing. Rhett moved before I realized he'd moved. He had a coil of rope over his shoulder, and he gripped the rail with one hand and the rope with the other, as if it could be a lifeline to sanity. "Tie off!" he barked to no one in particular. Marla's camera swung on its strap like a pendulum. She clung to the older woman, Evelyn, who had gone very small and placid, like she'd resigned herself to being a weather vane. The passengers shouted. The couple wanted to turn back. They wanted to be back on the jetty, to the smell of pie and the safety of lamplight. Tommy's face was set into something like a plan. He had the skiff angled toward the lighthouse, trying to give us stern to the waves, the only thing that might keep us from broadsiding and being rolled. Then the engine coughed. A choking, final cough. For a second, the sound of the world around us, outraged waves, shouted prayers, my own breathing, exaggerated into an opera of panic. Tommy slammed the throttle and the motor answered with stutter and then silence. Silence on the lake is not peace. It's the moment before a verdict is read. We drifted. The waves heaved us like a cradle turned by a careless child. Water washed over the transom, and I felt the cold of it up my sleeves, sloshing into canvas and hair. Marla's camera hit the deck and skittered toward the stern, but stayed caught in the webbing, a scrap of metal and glass anchored by luck. I felt for the radio, old habit, but the antenna was bent and the static it threw back at me was thick and stupid. Something under the water moved with deliberate timing. It wasn't a fish. Fish panic. They scatter like loose coins. This movement was surgical. The skiff lurched as if a great hand had slid along its keel, and in the dark, a glow like a furnace light flickered beneath the surface, directly under the bow. Not sunlight, not anything we could name. An orange ember-sized halo that spread and pulsed like a heart seen through water. Jesus, Evelyn whispered. It was a small word, and I remember thinking then, in the middle of my body's reflex, that she had spoken the thing that named it. We had not anticipated malice. We had not prepared for the specific quality of being watched by a lake. Rhett moved again, this time to the bow. He gripped the rail and leaned over, peering into the black. His profile was sharp in the failing light. "There's something down there," he said. His voice was not the bravado of a young man. It had the bluntness of someone who had learned to name danger because naming it made it manageable. We all leaned, because that's what people do. They lean toward explanation. The glow had widened into a ring, and inside it there was a shape. Not a fish, not a log. It was long, and it had angles where angles should not be. For a moment it was only a silhouette. Then something slid along the skiff's shadow, and the ring dimmed and brightened like a lung. The water at the prow bubbled, as if whatever lay below was testing its air. The sensation in my bones said, "That thing is not part of this world." Marla started to cry then, a raw, thin sound. Tommy barked for calm, and his voice sounded small to me, as if it were being swallowed. "Listen," he said. The lake answered with a sound like low, distant bells. A keening that rode along the waves and came to us as if through netting. It was all wrong and right at the same time, musical, dreadful, and very old. "What is it?" one of the students demanded, finally abandoning civility. I wanted to tell them, "I don't know," but the words felt useless. We were all in a skiff with one dead motor and a creature beneath us interested in our choices. Telling each other we didn't know our fate felt like throwing wet towels on a fire. Rhett, stubborn as he was, threw the rope in a half hitch around the skiff's bow cleat and let the rest trail. His idea was simple: anchor the boat to something solid. I didn't see the logic in it, solid in a lake, but he was a practical man, and he had the kind of faith in rope that sailors respect. He tied off with knots done like prayers. The ring under the water swelled. From the center of the light, a darker shape rose toward us, not breaking the surface, but close enough that the water around it steamed with reflected light. It was the size of a canoe and long as a barn door, and there were ridges along its side that caught the faded light like teeth. For a second, the skiff listed as if someone had leaned against its ribs from the inside. Tommy handed me a set of oars, the kind with worn varnish and a scent of Old Bay. "We might have to row," he said, voice gone thin. "If the motor won't take us, we row." I grabbed the oars like a man grabbing the ones who keep him upright. The nearest land was the lighthouse jetty, maybe 200 yards away if the bay were honest. If it were honest. Rhett had stepped onto the bow to try to peer into the dark, and the thing under the water, whether it was curiosity or hunger, I could not tell then, pushed a wave against the hull, and for a terrifying second the skiff rode high and then clamped down hard enough to make us all cry out. Water cascaded into the boat and sent a cold, sonorous scream through the wood. The motor compartment flooded. I smelled the diesel again, bitter and close. Something struck the skiff's stern with a kind of polite, heavy curiosity. The boat rocked in an odd lateral beat, like the sound of a heartbeat you can only feel if you press your hand to an old clock. The glow under the bow fractured into sparks, and in the pause between the sparks, I thought I saw, for a heartbeat, eyes. Not animal eyes, too geometrical for that, but a depth that reflected me back to myself and made me feel like an idea I'd always had but never examined. "Row," Tommy snapped. We rowed. The oars bit into the water, and for a moment we pulled together as though muscle would restore sense. The lighthouse grew a little nearer, the jetty lumps of black and concrete like teeth. The thing under us pulsed, and the water around the skiff grew cold and heavy, thickened with something like patience. We were 60 feet from the jetty when it found the rope. The line we'd tossed, an act of defiance or desperation, threaded through something like a hook or gristle under the water and tightened. The skiff shuddered and stopped as if somebody had wrapped it in a glove. We tried to free the rope, but it was not a simple catch. The line wrapped and tightened with a logic that suggested intention. We could feel the tug like a hand taking a pulse. "Cut it!" someone yelled. There was a knife on the deck, a small thing, useful for bread and line. Rhett grabbed it and hacked at the rope. The line made a sound like a whale when it snapped free, and the skiff lurched forward with the released tension. The glow under the boat flared, a furious, sudden anger, and the surface broke. I cannot tell you whether what came up was solid or made of light. The boundary between them blurred. What I can tell you is that the thing smelled like the inside of a cave and like old coins, and when it moved, it made a sound that was exactly like a voice that knew every secret you had tried to forget. That voice said nothing I could translate, but the way the water moved around it spoke a language of intention. It nudged the skiff once, twice, and then, impossibly, it reached with a limb that was more like a shadow and touched the knees of the tired people on board, as if to test whether we were warm-blooded. I felt the touch as a cold that began at my ankle and crawled up like ink. It left a mark on my skin that I could not see, and later, long after we were on solid ground, I would trace with my fingertips as if reading a map. For now, I only knew the immediate terror that the thing could touch us without breaking the grace of the water. Tommy found the throttle with shaking hands, and the motor coughed back to life, a small, miraculous sound. We were not safe. The engine would not be robust enough for whatever had found us, but it was enough. Enough for him to angle the skiff toward the jetty, and enough for us to pull ourselves across that last ridiculous gap like sailors on the back of a nightmare. We made the jetty with water in our seats and the taste of iron in our mouths. People on the shore were yelling, flashlights blinking like moths. Marla sobbed into Evelyn's shoulder. Rhett sat down hard and laughed once, the sound thin and crazed. Tommy didn't laugh. He stood and looked out at the bay, at the place where the orange light had vanished, and for a moment, I thought his face looked older than it had the day before. None of us spoke for a long time. Language felt too small. The lighthouse keeper, Mr. Hargrove, a man who had lived on that point like a bracket on a book, came down the ramp with a blanket and a thermos and the kind of small yet simple help that people give when they cannot fix supernatural things. He wrapped us in wool and muttered about checking the skiff. "You saw it?" he asked. Not a question, but a hope. We nodded. I found my voice finally and rasped words I had not thought to have. "It touched us." Hargrove's face went flat. He said softly, "The bay remembers." Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After we were wrapped in blankets and the lighthouse's beam swung like a slow, indifferent eye, Port Wren did what small towns do best and worst. It gathered. People arrived on the jetty in boots and wool coats, faces set in the particular combination of alarm and curiosity that looks like concern from across a poker table. Someone passed around a thermos of coffee that tasted like bitter salvation. Someone else held up a phone and argued with reception, trying to call someone who could make the world make sense again. June Whitaker arrived with her cardigan buttoned up to her chin and a look that said she'd been waiting for this story her whole life. She hugged me like she was claiming me back, and I let her because the touch was small and solid. Rhett smoked a cigarette like a man who decided oxygen was optional. Tommy sat on the edge of the dock, elbows on his knees, staring at the place on the water where the light had pooled and then gone. His hands were stained with diesel and salt. They kept closing into something like prayer. People asked the expected questions. Did we see anything? Did anyone fall overboard? Was the motor ruined? But the question that buzzed under everything was quieter and stranger. What had touched us? The lake, for all its friendliness and fisheries brochures, had committed an intimacy that felt obscene. We had been examined. Deputy Ben Klein took the kind of breath that meant he would put his practical skills to use. He examined the skiff like a mechanic and like a detective, lifting boards and peering where most eyes wouldn't bother. His face was calm, but there was a crease in his brow that suggested worry deeper than a municipal paper could print. He asked the technical questions. Seawater in the motor compartment, unusual eddy patterns, whether the rope had had any barnacles that might snag on something underwater. His notebook filled with angles and facts. Then he closed it and said, "We'll log it." No one wanted to admit that log it was townspeak for hope it doesn't come up again. That night, I didn't sleep. The bay lived in me like a second heartbeat. My dreams turned to long corridors of water where the light moved independently of my steps. Sometimes I would wake and swear the floorboards creaked beneath my feet with a wet, placing sound, and I would find nothing but the window open and the sky knee-deep in stars. June would call up the stairs, "You alive?" And I'd lie and say yes, meaning it in a way a man means alive when he isn't sure which version of life he keeps. The mark on my ankle stayed. It was pale at first, almost like a bruise, and then it rose in a line of thin, fishbone ridges that itched in a way that would not be soothed. I fancied myself brave until I saw it in the mirror, a subtle map I had not inked, and my stomach dropped with a vertigo of recognition. Rhett had one too, smaller and darker like a coin pressed under skin. Marla's fingers showed webbed white crescents where the water had touched her knuckles. Evelyn, the old woman, had no visible mark, but she kept rubbing her hands together as if she could knead out something she'd seen. Marla took to the lighthouse's archive like a woman possessed. She had an intensity about her when she wanted to find something. It was the same intensity she used in photography when she wanted to squeeze truth out of light. She combed town records and old newspapers, flipping brittle pages in the museum's dim reading room. "The Bay remembers," Hargrove had said, and Marla took it as a sentence with an endnote. She found a clipping from 1932 buried inside a stack of accounts about storm damage. It was a small paragraph at the bottom of the page, the kind of thing editors put when they needed space. Local fisherman Henry Talmadge reported strange lights and echoed sounds near North Arm Lighthouse. Vessel found intact, crew shaken. No casualties. There were similar notes in 1957 and 1974. Each report was brief and shrugged off as bad weather, optical illusions, the sort of thing you pass in the margins of local history. There were patterns, though. Nights of warm currents, odd equipment failure, a tendency for the reports to center around the North Arm. Marla taped the clippings to a board in the museum basement like a conspiracy theorist assembling holy proof. And when she invited me to look at it, the hairs along my arms stood up as if the place itself had become conductive. Ben interviewed the fishermen that week. Old men in knit caps talked about currents that came alive, about nets loosening from their moorings in ways no crab could explain. They told stories of fishermen who'd gone missing and turned up days later with their hair white as the gulls' bellies and eyes that didn't belong to the manfolk who had left the pier. Some of the claims were superstitious, the lake as an angry maiden. Others were more practical, gear disappearing, buoys dragged away. The fishermen called it something in the bones of the bay. Their laughter when they admitted to such talk was nervous and quick. Port Wren did what small towns also do. It held a meeting at the community center. People came with casseroles and with crossed arms. "Is this going to hurt tourism?" someone asked, and the question landed like a gauntlet. Others demanded patrols, or for someone to hire divers and fish out whatever might be down there. Deputy Ben, a man who believed in linear cause and effect, proposed more mundane safeguards. Stricter signage, better radios, mandatory safety briefings. The town council nodded and voted on measures that felt like applying Band-Aids to a chest wound. Meanwhile, the thing in the water was not content to be a headline. Small, inexplicable incidents began curling through our days. A boy found at dawn on the marina steps babbled of hands that tasted like pennies and couldn't remember which dock he had slept on. A family dog that had eaten every kind of bait and bone suddenly refused to go near the shoreline, whining and nosing a circle into the sand as if digging for a lost ring. September storms came early that year and sent the gulls inland like exiles. People began to cross the bay with more caution. Patrons canceled harbor tours for a while. The tourist brochures were retouched, and the town kept its eye on the water like a man at a poker table who knows someone else has the better hand. Hargrove, the lighthouse keeper, told me a story one afternoon as we sat on the breakwater and watched the bay fold its reflection into itself. My granddad used to say there's a place the world doesn't want to tell you about, he said, and I could see the way the mast of the lighthouse cut into the sky behind him. Old people called it a throat. Sometimes a lake has been shaped by something that isn't done. It keeps coming back asking for what it thinks it's owed. That line, asking for what it's owed, lodged under my skin next to the mark, and there it stayed. I tried to live a normal life. I pulled a summer shift steering people toward lighthouses while my hands trembled and my mind planned for a thing that might or might not return. I drank less and ate whatever June cooked for me because she was always making dinners like small armors of kindness. Still at night, the bay shaped my dreaming, and the mark on my leg itched like a promise. Weeks passed. The town grew used to a frayed normal, and then something else happened. A boy named Owen Marsh, who worked summers with Rhett at the marina and who had a laugh like church bells, didn't show up for his shift. His truck was at the parking lot and his boots were on the dock. He was last seen after dark walking his dog, perhaps to look at the stars. The sheriff's office organized a search, and Ben, who had the look of a man made of rope and concern, called on the fishermen to come and help. We combed the shoreline and the mudflats and called out until our voices were small. 3 days later, they found his jacket on the rocks, pinned down by a heavy, salt-eaten coil of rope. Inside the cuff, the lining was damp and smelled like a cellar of old coins. There were no footprints away from the edge. Owen himself was gone, like a name scissored from a page. We held another meeting in the community center that night, and the town's laughter dried to dust. The words missing and presumed drowned hung in the air like gull feathers. I felt responsible in the exact way a man feels responsible for a fire he did not start but failed to stop. My dreams amplified. The mark on my leg throbbed in sympathy whenever the bay made a small sound. Rhett drank heavily and blamed the water, and then blamed himself, and then muttered at night to a silence that didn't answer. Marla kept her camera on the windowsill pointed at the bay, waiting for the light, or for a motion that might be useful. Deputy Ben kept to routine and paperwork. The rest of us kept the rituals we knew: coffee at June's, the harbor watch at dusk, the shrug of putting nets away for a night. The bay, like most living things that have been denied their due, began making claims. Not huge demands in language we knew, but small incursions: a net snagged with no rock, a toy car found at low tide far from any child's reach, the steady presence of that faint metallic odor that smelled of pennies, coins, old pockets. People started to whisper in the grocery line, and mothers checked their children's shoes before the walk to school the way one checks for knotholes in a house that might collapse. I walked the jetty at night sometimes to feel the place and see whether it would speak to me. It did speak, but not in the way I wanted. The sound it made was patient, amused, and impossibly old. Sometimes I thought I heard my name in that sound, not spoken, but suggested like a bookmark. Each time the bay's voice shifted something inside me. The mark it left curled and reminded me that we are small and that some questions aren't meant to be answered. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The town wanted answers, and answers are the one thing the bay refuses to hand over without a trade. So we made a bargain with curiosity and went looking for the thing that kept turning up in margins and dusted pages. An origin story, some human clue to hang a rope on. If there's a practical hero in a story like this, it's usually the person who keeps showing up. In my case, that was me. I wanted to fix it because I was the one with the mark, the one who had felt its touch. I wanted to fix it because Owen was gone, and because you feel responsible for the world when it tips sideways and the people you love fall out. Marla found the ledger finally, taped behind the museum's payroll book like a secret waiting for an afternoon. It was a mariner's log from 1896, brittle, smelling of salt and mildew, and it belonged to a schooner called the Larkspur, which had, according to the faded handwriting, hit something odd near the north arm and hauled up a chest of coins. The log's last entry was a string of expletives and a line that read simply, "We took it. Light darkened. Men turned on one another. God forgive." Beneath that, in a crusted hand, somebody had scrawled a sentence that made the hairs along my arm stand up. If you take what isn't yours, the water remembers the debt. Hargrove, who was older than all the stories combined and smelled always of paraffin and good tobacco, told us about the larkspur in his slow voice. He had an old map with a patch where the bay's bottom shifted like a sewn seam. That patch, he said, had been called the throat by men with eyes like knuckles. There's things down there, he said, things that collect what's loose in the world. It sounded metaphoric until Rhett found, under the dock planks a week later, a coin not from any mint we knew, stamped with a pattern that looked like a key and a face I could not place. The pattern of things fit like pieces of a shipwreck. The bay wanted its ledger balanced. The coins were not ordinary currency. They smelled old as memory and hummed faintly when the tide moved over them. Someone, perhaps men desperate in 1896, perhaps ordinary thieves with no sense of the holy, had taken a cache that did not belong to them. The bay had been patient. Then it had begun to ask. We debated what to do. Ben said we should call the university, professionals with cold instruments and rational meters. The town council discussed liability and press releases. Marla wanted to throw the coins back at low tide with a blessing and a photograph. Rhett wanted to explode the whole site and blow the thing from the bay with the fury of men who had lost friends. I wanted a plan that involved being small and honest and not leaning on explosives. We settled, the way towns like ours settle, on a mixture of show and tell, an organized attempt to return what had been taken, witnessed by as many human witnesses as possible so there could be no doubt of intent. We waited for a night when the moon hung like a coin in the sky and the wind lay upon the water like a sheet. Hargrove came with the museum's lamp, Marla with the log and her camera, Ben with spare life jackets and a skepticism so organized it could have been a religion, and Rhett with rope and a hatchet. Tommy lent us Maggie's pride because he trusted us the way boatmen trust the harbor, thinly and by necessity. We rowed to the North Arm in silence, each of us carrying something we thought might be needed, a rope, a coin, a prayer the way old women tuck parsley into pastry. The lighthouse blinked its long, slow signal, and we felt small as a string of thought. Up close, the place was quieter than I expected, as if the world had removed its ears and left us to talk to the stone. The water lay flat, suspiciously polite. We read the log aloud because stories like that don't have the dignity of being kept quiet. We phrased the old man's guilt into the night, and when we reached the last line, we held our breath and pulled a coin from the pocket June had sewn into her coat. It glinted in the lamplight like a small, insolent sun. Marla set her camera on a tripod and aimed it at the bay as if proof could be caught on film the way wind can be seen in trees. I walked to the prow and placed the coin on the skiff's bow like an offering. My hands were shaking but steady in the way a surgeon's hands can be. I thought of Owen and the blank space he left in the dock's summer cadence. I thought of the mark on my leg and how an unasked-for intimacy had rewritten my skin. I thought, as people do in last chance moments, of all the things I could say to the water if the water were an old friend. "I'm sorry," I said, because apologies are the one currency that doesn't rust. We pushed the coin over the side. For a second, nothing happened. Then the water folded under it and carried it like a polite guest ushered into a house. The ripple moved outward and the skiff tilted. The bay accepted what we offered with a bureaucratic slowness, a consideration you see in judges who take their time before mercy or verdict. And then it rose. Not the creature we had seen before, but something that carried the same geometry of wrongness, a blackness like compressed night, circled by the dim halo that had glowed under our hull. The shape surfed the water toward the skiff, and again there was that voice, not linguistic, but the sense that the world had read your private pages and smiled politely. It nudged the bow once, and a sound like coins in a dry sack came from deep under. For a moment, the bay and I seemed to be negotiating a balance. "The coin!" Marla shouted, but it was rhetorical because the coin was gone and the bay had registered receipt. The water around the skiff warmed the way a hearth warms a room. It was not comfort so much as acknowledgement. The mark on my leg stung like a memory being rewritten. My skin lifted and the fishbone ridge I'd traced for weeks shimmered and then calmed, like a tide creeping back into itself. "We did it," Rhett breathed. though his voice carried something like a question. The air around us felt different, not bright or blessed, but mollified. The darkness slipped back into the lake with the care of a thing replacing a treasured volume on a shelf. The glow under the prow winked out, and the surface smoothed like a wound scarred over. We stayed there for a long while, as if waiting for an afterword. No one clapped. Marla packed her camera and the log. Hargrove said a simple sentence that felt like blessing and policy. We pay to the water what the water has bled for. We stay honest from now on. Owen was found before dawn the next day. He was at the edge of town, asleep under a bush with his dog curled on his chest, mud in his hair, and a small old coin folded inside his hand like a compass. He remembered nothing of where he'd been. He would later say he had dreamed of a ship that wanted its stones back. He was quiet and a little further away than before, as if the bay had touched his mind and left a page missing. He would laugh again, but sometimes at night he sat by the window and stared at the water like a man who'd read his own obituary. We were not healed in any grand way. The town's fear dimmed into a wary habit. Tourists filled the harbor again in the summer with brochures that said nothing of debts paid. The fishermen went back to their nets because the sea feeds those who feed it, and because men need to keep their hands busy so their heads do not fill with ghosts. Rhett bought a new coil of rope and kept it like an amulet. Marla developed a series of photographs that no gallery would accept. They were too full of halos and not enough explanation. Ben filed his report and kept an extra flashlight by the patrol car. As for me, the mark faded until it was only a faint memory under my skin. It never disappeared entirely. Sometimes after storms, I could feel a whisper of it like static. I keep my distance from the false safety of bravado, and I do not go alone onto the water at night. I write this now because stories once told alter the teller. Saying what happened will not undo it, but it stitches a seam across the place where the world tore. People ask if I believe in what we did that night, if the coin was a cure or a trick. I believe in the ritual of restitution because it made the thing in the water pause long enough for a boy to return and for a town to breathe. Whether that pause is permanent or merely a reprieve, I cannot say. What the Bay taught me, and what I try to teach you if you are listening like someone holding a cup beneath a drip, is that some debt is not measured in dollars, but in the small, old things we take for ourselves without asking. A lake remembers, and sometimes it takes its memory back. We pay our debts in gestures and coins and truth. We keep our hands clean. We listen when the water speaks, and when it asks for what it believes is owed, we answer with humility. I still walk the jetty sometimes, and when the moon is a coin, I imagine the larkspur riding the swell of history and men in old coats watching the water close over their mistakes. I think of Owen, of Rhett, of Marla's stubborn eyes, and of June's hands, those human anchors that kept me from being a story with no ending. I tell you this not to frighten you for the sake of terror, but because truth can be stranger and more merciful than fear. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 32 years old the night it happened, September 18th, 2016. I still say those three details like a prayer. The name, because someone once told me a story begins when a voice owns it. The age, because people change in slices, and 32 was the slice that broke me. The date, because the lake keeps records better than I do. Listen close. I'll tell you why I was on the shore of Grand Traverse Bay, where I was coming from, who I thought I was, and how a quiet water and a colder wind turned a safe place into a long, terrible memory. I grew up in a town called Clearwater Ridge, a little invented corner of Michigan tucked between highways, pizzerias, and the kind of hardware store that still sells ice scrapers in June. My father, Jonas Cole, ran the bait shop by day and dreamed carpentry by night. He taught me knots and how to listen to weather, how the lake smells different when rain's coming. My mother, Lorraine, kept the kitchen warm and the bills paid. She taught me the names of birds and how to make a house feel like a home, even when home felt like an idea. I had a younger sister, May, who never feared anything except missing her bus. Folks in town said I had a steady life, steady job at an auto shop, steady girlfriend until she moved to Chicago for art school. Steady enough for comfort, dull enough for hunger. Grand Traverse Bay sits like a cupped hand of water off Lake Michigan, two arms reaching out, west arm and east arm, with Traverse City perched at the elbow, tasting cherries and tourists in the summer. I'd been going there since I was a kid. We'd fish, swim, and sometimes borrow a boat to get farther away from shore in the world. There's a map of memory that people who love a place carry. Your favorite pier, the scrape of the shoreline, the bend of a road where the maples lean in to gossip. For me, that map had a place called Gull's Point, a stub of land that jutted out and made a small harbor where boats bobbed like lullabies. In daylight, gulls nested there, families picnicked, and tourists took photos of sunsets that looked like spilled coins. At night, though, Gull's Point had a way of folding in on itself. The lights from town could reach only so far, and beyond that the air tasted like old metal and old secrets. I wasn't popular in the way some men are. I wasn't the loudest or the cleverest. I had friends like Sam Wilkes, a broad-shouldered mechanic with a laugh like a bell, and Miles Grant, who claimed to have been everywhere and had the tan to prove it. There was also Anna Clark, a teacher who tutored kids in math and could fix a flat with an efficiency that made you wonder if she'd been an army engineer in another life. My circle was small, but it was my weather, predictable enough to trust, unusual enough to enjoy. That September, the fall had come abrupt and beautiful. The cherries were a thing of memory, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and the hurried shuffle of jackets. I'd been restless. After Elisa left for Chicago, some part of me wanted proof that the world didn't end when someone you loved moved away. Sam and Miles had been planning a night on Gull's Point for weeks, not to party so much as to prove we could sit still under the sky and not talk about anything important. Anna had been invited too. She had a way of calming us, and we all agreed it would be a quiet night. Beer, a small fire, a boat tethered to the dock in case the cold sky changed its mind. I remember the details like a ledger, the car's door closing, the sound of the engine as if someone exhaled. The playlist Sam made, half classic rock and half nonsense, the half-empty cooler in the back seat. We left around dusk when the light was the color of coinage, not gold, not silver, and the water was a dark cloth. The road to the point had stretches where trees leaned in like listeners. The air cooled as we neared the bay. There was a smell of brine, though an inland bay like Traverse's is mostly fresh, and the scent puzzled me then and puzzles me now when I try to name it. When we arrived, Gull's Point looked exactly as it always had. Familiar, friendly, with summer chairs stacked like sleeping animals, and the small dock reaching into the dark like an invitation. I could see the lights from town as a smudged constellation. Behind us, the road would take anyone home. That night, the water was flat, too flat, like glass left inside a closed room. The moon was a fragment behind clouds. The breeze, which should have been a presence, was mute. We unloaded silently, more from habit than plan. There was an oddness to the quiet that felt like someone turning the volume down on the world. Before the main thing, the event that pulls the rest into focus, I want to tell you about how we were mapped against each other. Sam liked to take charge, to point, to decide, and we followed him because he was funny and blunt, and because doing nothing felt like a betrayal sometimes. Miles carried a pocket knife, a ridiculous compass, and a wallet full of bus tickets from other summers, which he would show to prove he'd been brave. Anna brought a thermos of coffee and a book, and she read the book in fits and starts, always looking up as if checking the horizon for good news. I, in that triangle, was the quiet one, the keeper of smaller details. Which beer was left, where the extra blanket was, whether the dock seemed to sit lower in the water than it should. We walked the point together. The stones underfoot had the coolness of long membership. The grass leaned like a congregation toward the water. We set the fire in a circle the way we always did. Stones, kindling, paper from an old newspaper Sam had stuffed in his pocket. The sparks went up and then down, and the night centered on the small, growing orange bowl in front of us. We made the usual jokes about bears and bugs and whether Miles would finally own a steady job. Someone, I can't remember who, suggested we take the boat out just a little ways to see the lights from the water. Nobody was eager. It was more the kind of dare that lands with the weight of something older. "We've done this since we were kids," someone said. "Why stop now?" I should have listened to the lake. I should have heard the way it asked for patience and respect and the kind of small reverence that people who live by big water learn early. The main story, the thing that burned into me like a brand, began after that suggestion, just past the point where our faces glowed in the firelight and the small, safe circle seemed unbroken. But I'll stop here and let the night come forward in its own voice. When I say I started the boat, that isn't the whole of it. What matters is the way the world shifted when we left the familiar shore. The water took us and kept us in a small, rolling hand, and then something else happened. Something that I will tell you when you say next and are ready for the rest. For now, remember the names and faces, the date and the map of the town and the point. They matter. They are the frame of the thing that followed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We pushed off the dock with the sort of clumsy confidence that comes from habit and too many summer nights. The motor coughed and then steadied, a small, obedient animal. I remember the way the beam of Sam's flashlight cut across the bay like a question mark, the way the boat slid away from the point and left the familiar shore picture behind, the stacked chairs, the dim halo of the fire, the little smear of headlights from the road. For a few minutes, everything felt exactly as it should. Warm, foolish, ordinary. We sat, the three of us and Anna, with the lake breathing around us. The town lights glittered like a distant orchestra, and the water reflected them in small, dishonest ways. Conversation fell to a casual low, Miles telling a story he'd told before, Sam making a joke that landed with a clink. Anna had wrapped the thermos across her lap and was staring at the water as if trying to read its handwriting. I kept my hand on the gunwale, feeling the small, constant thrumming of the motor through my palm. It should have been enough. It wasn't. The first odd thing was the fog. We'd left under clear sky. Our weather sense would have told us there wouldn't be fog until later in October. But the air changed without warning, as if someone decided to redraw the world in softer lines. A wet, candle smoke haze rolled in from the east, swallowing the town lights and making the water around us a shallow, anonymous black. It arrived like a curtain, and the world narrowed to the circle of our headlamps. Probably just a low bank, Miles said, trying for lightness. He thumbed his compass, the ridiculous little brass thing, as if brass could argue with weather. Sam turned the motor down, then up, then down again, listening. He had a way of listening to things that wasn't just with ears. It was the same manner he used when he fixed an engine. Patient, exacting. I felt a drop, not rain, but something colder and thinner, like the air had been shaved. The boat rocked a hair and then steadied. Anna looked at me and said, "Do you smell that?" She'd always had that teacher's ability to name the small changes others missed. There was a chemical tang beneath the lake smell, something metallic and faintly sweet. It made my throat tighten. We decided to row a little farther into the fog to see if the haze gave way to clarity. It felt, at the time, both brave and stupid, the way kids walk into a dark basement because someone dared them. The motor's hum was suddenly small and fragile. Our headlamps pooled in the mist and gave us the impression of a tiny island of light drifting through a much larger shadow. Then the compass went wrong. Miles checked it and swore softly. The needle spun a fraction and then stopped, pointing somewhere that made no sense. Sam swore and thumbed the console. The motor coughed and then died. For a moment, we were like a thing in the palm of a giant's hand. The silence the motor left was not quiet. It was heavy, expectant of that metallic smell. We drifted. The boat turned slowly, and the lights of the shore had vanished into a fog so settled it felt like we'd been separated from the world by a door. The radio on the console gave only static, a small white hiss that seemed to echo all the way into my teeth. Miles nudged the motor with an oar. It tried and failed. "Battery's dead," he said. None of us liked that phrase. It sounded like an accusation. In the distance, a sound found us, not from the sky, not from the shore, but from the water itself. A long, low thrumming that felt like a voice under the lake. It started as a suggestion, a vibration through the hull, a pressure change that made the hair along my forearm stand up. Then it became recognizable, a rhythmic thump, like a distant heart or a boat's engine that didn't belong to any of us. Anna's grip on the thermos tightened. "That's a boat," she said, but there was no light where a boat should be, only fog and the thin ring of our lamps. The sound moved around us, clockwise, then counter, as if whatever made it was circling, deciding. Sam grabbed the flashlight and swept it through the haze. The beam struck something and then failed. The batteries had become useless whispers, drained by whatever the fog wanted. Maybe an old barge, Miles offered. He sounded older suddenly, as if he knew the weight words could carry on a night like that. The thump answered him by following his tone, quickening just a fraction as if to answer back. I felt the boat respond. The oars bobbed in the water like tired arms. We tried the phone. I thumbed the call button until my fingers ached. No service. Anna tried her teacher's calm voice on a number she knew by heart and got only a recorded language that meant the same thing. You are alone. We were a small human cluster in a sphere of wet gray. At some point in that fog, time fractured. A minute could have been an hour could have been a breath. I remember thinking of my father at the bait shop, how he would have cursed the motor and then fixed it by midnight, how he would know the lake's moods as if they were old dogs. My memory reached for those lessons and found only static. The thump changed tone, and in doing so, changed our understanding of the night. It went from a distant engine to a pattern, 2 soft thuds, then a longer low boom, then a silence like someone holding their breath. It repeated in a cadence that felt deliberate, almost like a language. We listened because you listen, because there's always hope that a pattern has a reason. Then the light came for the first time, not from a boat or shore, but from below the water. A pale, greenish glow, diffuse and wrong, pressed up through the fog and painted the undersides of our chins with the color of old coins. It revealed only the edges of things, the spiral of my palm, the lines around Sam's eyes, the way Miles's jaw clenched. The glow rose as if something vast and slow had inhaled and decided to show itself. It moved beneath the surface, not through waves, but through a calm we'd mistaken for water. The boat rocked as if something had brushed it. The thump increased, synchronizing with the rise of that green light, and in that synchronization there was intent. Miles stood. We should get to shore, he said, in the way people say things they think are obvious. Sam tried the motor again, and curses rose and fell like small birds. My mind, which had been trying to catalog the ordinary things, where the blanket was, which oar had the crack, leapt to the only question that mattered. What is out there, and why is it looking at us? We were fools, perhaps, for staying, but there are kinds of stubbornness that are a defense. We had, in our small cluster, a history of nights and dares and little reckoning with danger. That stubbornness kept us there long enough for the water to show us something like a shape. At first, it was only a displacement, a moving absence where the light bent wrong. The mist braided into it, and then the boat listed as if someone had leaned hard against its side. Miles lost his balance. For a second, the world turned the way the boat did, and then he was over the side with a sound that cut the fog like a new instrument, a sound between a shout and a gurgle. The water took him without fuss. For the first time that night, the thing below the surface made itself known in its scale by what it could accept without a ripple. Sam dove in without pausing. Anna screamed. I grabbed the oar and swung it toward the splash. All of us moved as if in a dream, automatic, certain, and yet wrong. I could see Miles under the surface, a bobbing dark thing, then gone. The green light swelled beneath our feet and the boat tipped more. The thump became a chant and the fog closed ranks like witnesses. I reached the edge, hand out, fingers brushing cold, and then something more than cold gripped my wrist. Not a hand, exactly, but a pressure that closed like a fist. It pulled with a patient, inexorable motion that dragged me toward the dark. For a second, I thought of the bait shop and warm bread and my father's voice telling me to keep my fingers clean. I thought of Anna's face, pale and wet, and of Sam's shout in the water. Then the fog swallowed the boat and the light below us became a bright, hungry eye. Whatever it was, and I will tell you what I think it was in the next part, it had decided we were an answer to something it had been waiting to ask. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The hand that gripped my wrist had the chill of deep winter and the patience of something that had waited long before I was born. Underwater, everything stretched. Sound, time, the weight of my breath, until a single inhale felt like a lifetime. For an instant, the world narrowed to the pressure at my elbow and the green light that poured through the water like a molten coin. I I remember thinking not of drowning, but of small, ordinary things. My father's hands smelling of cedar, May's laugh in the kitchen, the knot he'd shown me that never slipped. Those memories were a rope, and I clung to them like a man who knows he will be judged by the things he loved. The thing that held me did not feel like a creature with teeth. It felt like a presence, a large, patient question. And when it let me see, it showed me images as if reading from an old ledger. I saw a boat in winter, masts broken, people huddled and small. I saw a map with a place circled in red. It showed me Gulls Point across decades. Children chasing gulls, a family picnicking, men hauling crates, a woman with a scarf that kept coming free. The images had a slow grief to them, like a photograph left in the rain. Each glimpse was a thread, and as it pulled me, the threads braided into a story I recognized because the names were my own. Names I'd never spoken aloud to this lake. Pain, when it came, was not violent. It was a recognition. A pressure on my temple was a wordless translation of an old wrong. I remembered with a ruthless clarity that felt like being opened up and read the night years earlier when my sister May had asked me to take her to the hill and I'd said no because I had plans, stupid, small plans that revolved around a woman and a job and the idea of being steady. She'd been disappointed, yes, but she'd forgiven me. Kids forgive. The lake did not forgive. The presence folded that memory into its palm and let me feel the gravity of absence, how a single omission can weigh on a place and everything that lives on it. I do not claim to be religious, but in those moments, I understood what some people mean when they say the world is a ledger. Every place keeps its accounts. The lake, it seemed, had an old list of debts and a method for collecting. It wanted attention or apology, or to be told something it had been waiting to hear. The green light pulsed like a slow heart, as if waiting for an answer. I said the wrong thing first. In my panic, I cursed it, a small, human bluster that landed like a fly. The pressure tightened, and for an instant the images ran together into thunder. A ferry breaking, winter ice, voices swallowed by water. Then, like a breath between teeth, a warmth touched the corner of my mind. My father's voice telling me to speak plainly. Tell it the truth, he would have said. Names, dates, the small things. I did not know why telling the truth might matter, but some part of me understood the bargain. So I told it. I whispered names into that cold as if the water could carry them like driftwood. May, Lorraine, Jonas. I named the bait shop and the cracked stool where I used to sit, and when I reached for the name I had been holding like a secret, Elisa. The pressure eased. The green light trembled and the images softened, as if the ledger had accepted a line item. The hold became less a hand and more a guiding weight, and the lake angled me upward like tide toward shore. I broke the surface, struggling and coughing up a bitter, metallic taste that lingered like regret. The air was the same September that had left earlier, but the fog had thickened into a thing that clung to my teeth. I spat water and blinked, and the world returned in pieces. Sam thrashing nearby, a blur of arms and hair. Anna hanging onto the gunwale with white-knuckled hands, the boat listing like a tired thing. The motor was a dead heart. The radio spat static and then silence. Ethan. Anna's voice was razor and prayer. She was a teacher. The way she moved toward me had the precision of someone used to getting children out of trouble. Sam was coughing, sputtering a name that sounded like Miles until it cracked into nothing. For a moment I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Then Anna pointed across the water where the fog had swallowed everything but the faint halo of the green light. There was a slickness to the surface. Not oil, but a sheen that clung to the boat's hull and smelled of iron and old pennies. The compass lay face down on the floorboards, its needle still. Miles wasn't there. My hands fumbled for the oar as if an oar could stitch us back into the world. Sam's face was the color of fish, his lips moving as if forming a prayer he'd never learned. "He's gone," Sam said finally, voice raw. That two-syllable sentence dropped into the boat and caused it to sway again. It landed like an accusation and a fact at once. The fog thickened and the green light rolled slowly like a slow, patient eye. We did the things people do when half of their sense is panic and the other half is muscle memory. Anna put her hands on Sam's chest and forced the breath he hadn't managed to take. I leaned over the side and peered into the dark, feeling the lake's cool breath on my face. I called Miles' name until my voice cracked. The only answer was the soft, rhythmic thump that had followed us earlier, the same cadence, as if the lake kept time with a heartbeat we could not match. There were no businesses in my head that night, nor any heroics, only the blunt arithmetic of what we had left and what we had lost. Miles' absence was a hole in our small human shape, one that could not be measured but that altered the physics of everything else. Sam coughed, and for the first time since the fog came down, he laughed. A broken sound that was half relief and half terror. "We have to get to shore," he said, and the words were a map of intention: land, light, people. But the lake had other plans. As we tried the motor again, an attempt that felt like testing a pulse, the boat listed to the side and the green light swelled brighter this time, close enough that I could see the ripples of its glow on the water's skin. In that light, something else was visible. A line of small, dark shapes under the surface, like debris or flotsam, and moving slowly in a direction that made no sense. I had the peculiar sensation of being watched by something patient and old, something that had cataloged us the way a historian catalogs ruin. Anna whispered, "It's asking for something." Her voice was a fragile thing. I did not know if she meant a person, a name, an apology, or simply the return of something it had lost. The fog, as if satisfied we had named the nature of the debt, thinned a fraction and let in a thread of starless sky. The green light dimmed, then retreated under the surface like a last acknowledgement. We turned the boat toward shore with hands that trembled but moved. The oars dug in and the water resisted and then relented. The radio, for a breath, spat the distant murmur of another night. People laughing, the tinny applause of someone at a bar, a dog barking. It was an incantation that made me think of small mercies and the fragile line between being kept and being lost. We did not have Miles. That fact settled like a stone in my gut and would be the weight that tipped the rest of the night into its final, shape-changing hour. As we drifted, Anna held Sam's hand like a prayer and wiped the water from his mouth with the back of her wrist. I sat forward, looking into the fog and trying to file the images the lake had shown me into something useful. Names, a map, a ledger. I would need them later. The green light sank beneath the surface, and the fog thinned until the outline of Gull's Point emerged like a worried family. On the shore, two lights, car headlights or flashlights, I couldn't be sure, were moving, someone calling into the dark. Voices from the road reached our ears like rescued birds. Relief hit like muscle, but relief in the presence of loss is always the thin kind. We drew the boat up onto the rocks, hands raw. Sam sat in the sand and wept into his palms like a child. Anna whispered Miles's name and then stopped because naming him over and over felt like offering him up to the lake's appetite. I stared at the water where the green light had been and thought of the ledger and the back and forth between owing and paying. I felt, with a new and sharp clarity, that the lake had taken a ledger entry and left a question in its place. A question that would not be answered by simple rescue or the passing of time. "We have to go back," I said, and even saying it felt like crossing a line. My voice surprised me because I thought it would be angry or foolish, but it was quiet, like the turning of a page. Anna looked at me, eyes sharp with something that was not quite fear and not yet courage. "We don't leave anyone," she said. The sentence hung between us and became a promise, so we planned to go back. We patched the motor the way people patch things they are not qualified to patch, with hope, a roll of tape, and a prayer. The lights on the shore seemed to listen, and the fog retreated like an animal with something to hide. Somewhere inside me, the lake's ledger sat open and waiting for another entry. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We pushed off again before dawn, this time with lights that could have been used to land a plane in a town that smelled like coffee and fear. Word travels fast in small places, and by 4 a.m, there were hands on the dock that shouldn't have been there if superstition meant anything. The sheriff with a flashlight and a face like a closed book, 2 fishermen who'd been up all night mending nets, and Anna, who refused to leave until every possible thing was tried. Sam sat in the bow with the paper towel still on his hands from when he'd tried to catch Miles, his jaw set like a man who'd misplaced the part of himself that did not panic. We had a better motor and bolts of rope and a life preserver that looked like a relic of hope. Someone brought a long pole with a hook. Someone else had a camera because our age had to witness everything. The sheriff asked questions, but his eyes were on the water. He had been around lakes long enough to know that they keep their counsel. "We'll run a search pattern," he said, "practical and small. We'll light up the bay, sweep with the beam. If he's floating, we'll find him." The man's hands did not stop trembling. We went back into the fog with a plan. Grid the area, follow the thump if it came, use anchors to hold position and throw lines. We argued about whether to call in the state divers. The sheriff, who'd seen bureaucracies swallow time, said we should at least try ourselves first. The town waited with the patience of people who had put their lives on hold and then learned that waiting didn't help. The fog closed around us, and the green light returned like a memory you can't quite place. This time it was dimmer at first, a suggestion under the surface, and then it rose with the familiar, coin-cold glow. The hull vibrated as before, and the rhythmic thump pressed against the pads of my fingers like a heartbeat out of rhythm. But we had more than fear now. We had intent, names, and witnesses. "Say his name," Anna whispered. She'd been the one who'd insisted we speak when the lake first showed me the ledger. There are many forms of courage, and that insistence was one of them. We did. We said Miles' name until it pooled around us like a prayer. The green light responded with a slow swell, and the fog seemed to hum like an engine that had been turned over after years. When the lake let us see, what came up did not look like what it had once been. Miles rose in a slow roll of water and weed, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes open and glassy, but his expression was not the tidal, slack face one expects. There was something else in him, something older than the man we'd known, the look of someone who'd been shown a history not his own and then understood it. The fishermen beside me said nothing. Their hands were steady because hands steady themselves when they must do something grotesquely practical. We pulled him into the boat with ropes and the prayers of people who didn't think prayer ordinarily worked. The green light under the surface swelled, then receded as if reading the room. Miles was warm for a moment, then cooling, and when the sheriff felt a pulse, he said what we wanted to hear. Not everyone breathed then, but the sound of someone living made hope honest for a second. Sam wept quietly, like a man untethering himself, and I remember thinking his hands looked too small to hold what had been taken and then returned. At the landing, we had a procession that felt both ridiculous and solemn. A truck with headlights and a stretcher, and the townspeople standing like silent witnesses. Miles breathed shallowly in the ambulance while a medic worked with an exactness that belied hurried hands. The sheriff would later tell us he'd never seen a recovery like it. A body gone and then found whole enough to call recovery rather than rescue. We didn't have time for bureaucratic labels then. We had coffee that tasted like tiny consolations and a sky that grayly admitted it was morning. Miles woke after an hour and could not remember the span between falling from the boat and finding himself on the dock. He told us later, in fits and small sentences, that he'd felt hands like seaweed lift him, that he had been shown pictures and names in a language that felt like water. He described an old ferry full of people arguing over a scarf, a winter when someone tried to cross ice that did not hold, a woman who set a lantern down and could not find it again. What he recounted matched the ledger the lake had shown me, a pattern of little wrongs, of neglect and omission, of names not spoken until it was too late. The town, in the weeks that followed, poured its collective attention into Gull's Point. People brought lights and metal detectors and stories their grandparents had told by kitchen tables. We found old wreckage under silt, a rib from a boat long rotted, a fragment of a lantern, a leather glove gone brittle with time. Someone found a small set of initials carved into a cabin's frame that matched a name in the ledger. Small things, little accounting entries that the lake had been holding like IOUs. Where the ledger wanted names, the town supplied them. Where it wanted an apology, we gave something closer, a promise of remembrance. There were practical reasons for what followed. The sheriff held meetings and filed reports. Divers checked the bay for other debris. Scientists came who spoke in measured, cheerful ways about thermoclines and unusual fog formations. But there was a folk reckoning too. A bench near Gull's Point with a plaque that listed names, a yearly candlelight vigil in which people read aloud the names the lake had asked for. I, who had once been small in silence, stood and read them. Names of people I'd never met, names that tasted like pennies and cedar. Saying them out loud felt like laying down small stones so that the shore might not forget. Miles recovered in body and with a sort of haunted blessing. He took to visiting Gull's Point at odd hours, whispering things into the mist the way sailors whisper to calm seas. Sam went back to the shop with hands that worked like prayers, and Anna kept teaching until the end of the year, when she organized a field trip to the point and told the kids stories about respect. I returned to the bait shop and found that the lake's ledger had marked me because of the small omission about my sister. I had told the lake my truth, and in doing so had been given a second chance of a different sort, not to undo the past, but to pay attention to it. People asked whether we'd been visited by something supernatural, whether the lake had chosen to take and then return a life. Some asked for explanations that fit the neat lines of science. I do not know what the lake is. I only know that places remember and that there are consequences when people do not hear them. There's a humility to being part of something larger and older than your plans. I learned to listen better, to the weather, to the shoreline, to the small voices that tell you when to stay and when to leave. Years later, on warm nights when the bay is a dark, reflective coin, I walk out to Gull's Point. There's a bench with a small plaque and a breeze that always feels like apology. I put my palm on the rail and say the names that still sit under my tongue. I do not think the ledger is satisfied. Ledgers are never fully closed. But we have an ongoing account now, kept with lights and names and the steady human work of remembrance. If you come to Traverse in late September and you find the fog arriving earlier than you expect, remember this. The world you love keeps a record. It asks for what it thinks it's owed, not in malice, but in a weathered kind of patience. Pay attention, speak names, bring extra light. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Michael Avery. I was 32 years old on the night it happened, October 17th, 2019. I tell you that first because a storyteller should put names and dates into the dark so you can hold them there like a coin between your fingers, feeling its edges. Keep that coin. You'll be throwing it into Grand Traverse Bay before morning. If you know the Leelanau shoreline at all, you know how the wind behaves there, as if it remembers boat names and old arguments and keeps them in its teeth. My life before that night was ordinary in the way ordinary lives are quietly dangerous. Small debts, a steady job repairing navigation electronics at a marina on the East Bay, a rented house with creaks that sounded like conversations at night. I grew up 2 towns over, not quite a local, but allowed in by the kind of modest competence that gets you a key to a boat shed and a place to stand in the rain without being told to move along. I dated a woman named Lena for 3 years. We split the year before. I had a friend, Marcus Reed, who owned a fishing charter and a laugh that filled a room like a dropped anchor. He took me out on bad weather for money and on good weather for beer. There was a stray dog I fed named Finn who would follow me to the end of the pier and sit with his head cocked, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. People in town have names for places that are old as the salt lines on their caps. Mariner's Point, Old Lantern Road, the rock that locals call Widow's Knuckle. There are also stories, the kind small coastal towns keep like family photos. One of the stories was about a bell. Folks would lift a pint and tell you, with an ease meant to keep it harmless, that if you ever heard a bell ring over the water on a still night and there was no lighthouse in sight, you should turn away. The bell belonged to a ferry that sunk in the early 1900s, they said, or to a ship that never really belonged to either shore. Folks have heard it when the wind is wrong, an old dockhand told me once, just after midnight and just before he handed me a cigarette and asked for change. It don't mean anything good. I tell you that because towns tell themselves stories to explain the small cruelty of the world. The bay does not need a bell to be dangerous. It has rips, cold currents that take the heat from your arms, pockets where the water is a different personality from the surface. People drown in there from obvious mistakes. Too much whiskey, a slipped foot, a rope that wasn't tied right. And then there are drownings that feel like arrangements. The kind that friends look at in each other's faces and say nothing about, as if silence makes them a little less true. The week before October 17th was a slow one for me. The marina had cut hours. Marcus had taken a day job sanding floors on a job site inland. Lena had moved a box of old kitchenware through the mutual friends network, and I had stared at the wall of my living room and, for the first time in months, let myself think about the lake as something I could cross alone, as if the bay were a page I might read through. My hands were used to small mechanical things, screws, wires, the faint smell of ozone, and there was a kind of comfort to being useful in the way that kept your fingers busy and your mind off other people's faces. On the afternoon of the 17th, I fixed a compass unit for a charter boat down at Mariner's Point. The man who owned the boat paid in cash and tipped me with a 6-pack. He told me, casually, that the fog had been thicker out on the mouth of the bay that week, like it had rolled in from another sea. Old storms coming back to see their children, he said, and winked like he was telling a joke only he understood. I laughed, took the beer, and walked home along Old Lantern Road as the sky moved toward a heavy dusk. The pier lights hummed, and some lamps had a way of turning the asphalt into a smear of silver. The plan was simple. Check a mooring anchor at the far end of a small cove by the abandoned Coast Guard boathouse. The owner of the mooring had called in a panic. His buoy had started drifting, and with winter coming, anchors coming loose could mean damaged boats and bills that people in this town couldn't afford. Marcus wasn't available. Lena's schedule ran like a string of beads she kept to herself. So I packed a small kit, a coil of rope, a heavy lantern, my toolbox, and the old pocket knife my father had given me when I left for adult life, and walked to the pier with Finn trailing, eyes shining like coins. Up to this point, I could tell you about the character of the night. The moon high but cracked by cloud, the way the water tasted of iron on the air, the sound of gulls folding like paper. I could tell you about the people who mattered that week, and where they'd been when the world felt like it might change. But a storyteller saves his breath for the moment the story hinges. And so I will tell you what I knew, and then what I didn't. At around 10:40 p.m., with the lamps throwing ovals on the dock, I cut the motor on my little skiff and drifted toward the cove. The lantern I carried made a patchwork of light on the waves, small suns bobbing. The fog had a way of showing up like a thing that wanted to be invited. Tonight it hung in curtains and smelled faintly of wet wool. Finn sat on the stern, his ears flicking, his eyes catching points of light. The buoy was as the owner had described, bobbing too near the surface, its paint flaking like old memory. I readied the anchor rope. If you want the truth, the moment passed so easily that later I tried to find where it began. I remember reaching my hand for the buoy, feeling its slickness under my glove. I remember the sound, a bell, impossibly tiny, or perhaps the echo of metal in hulls, and I remember thinking it was someone else on the water. That thought is important. It is the moment my mind made a choice between the usual and the unseen. And then the story stopped being about routine checks and became about the bay changing shape around me. The lantern threw a lean of light, and in that slice of gold something moved, and not in the way of waves, nor like a fish. It was as if the surface had learned to breathe and then refused to exhale. The water folded in a way that made the skiff groan, and something cold touched my ankle beneath the deck. Not a hand, but a pressure, like a question asked of bone. My breath shortened. Above the fog, an impossible bell pealed once, thin, but long enough to touch the marrow in my arm. I had meant to fix an anchor. Instead, I found myself in a moment I would replay in my head for years. The rope slipping through my fingers, Finn's body tensing, the lantern throwing a small halo around us like judgment. The cold under the surface grew into a tug, patient and then assertive. I had seconds, and I chose what felt like the only reasonable thing. I leaned toward the bow to reach for the buoy and pulled, hard, as if pulling on any other rope. If you are listening now by a fire or under a blanket, know this. Some things about the bay are ordinary and must be respected. Some things are older than respect. My hands closed on the buoy. My weight shifted, and the water accepted me like it had been waiting for a name to call. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The tug didn't let up. For a moment, the world narrowed to the cold biting my calf, and the rope coiling in my hands like a living thing. Finn's whine cut through the fog, a single sharp note, and then the dog was gone over the stern like he had fallen through a grate. The lantern spun and threw light into the fog in a drunken circle. My first real thought was practical and absurdly small. Keep the lantern above water. Keep the rope. Keep breathing. I pulled with everything I had. The buoy came a fraction of an inch, then resisted as if anchored to something that didn't obey gravity. The skiff rocked, and I tasted new salt on my tongue, cold, metallic, like the mouth of a wound. My gloves slipped. For the first time, I felt a fear so ordinary it almost embarrassed me. The fear of failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at. I had untangled nets in worse weather, steadied drunk passengers, coaxed engines back to life. You learn a sort of small confidence on the water that feels like armor until it's not. Something under the surface moved with intent. It pushed, not in the way a current rolls, but as if the water itself had knuckles and was testing the tenderness of my ankle. I heard the bell again, not from any direction but everywhere, and that sound was like a hinge opening on a door I didn't want to look through. It wasn't the bell you hear in an old maritime tale. It was narrow and pinched, as if made from the metal of a teacup. Still, it carried meaning. Not a call to salvation, but an announcement. I tried to stand, thinking to wedge my weight forward and snap the line free. The skiff pitched. My hands found nothing but wet paint and rope. Finn's barking came from somewhere lower, muffled, and then a long, low ceasing. My heart stuttered in time. There are names for the sensations: hypoxia, shock, the body's rope of reflexes. But in that moment, they were a litany of small betrayals. My breath came out in one long cold string and then another. The lantern toppled, sputtered, its glass held like a small, stubborn moon. I reached out and my fingers closed on Finn's collar as something slick grazed my wrist. Not paws, not fins, but something that felt like the skin of old things. What happened next is both simple and impossible. The skiff tipped. I remember thinking, with the tilted clarity that pain gives, that I had failed the most reasonable test of my life. The world flipped and obeyed the sea. There's a kind of slow that isn't slow. Time stretched in a way that pulled all of the night's noises into a single long thread. The bell in the distance, the splash of the lantern, the sudden silence where Finn had been. When the water closed over my head, it wasn't like falling. It was like entering a room that forgot to welcome you. Under the surface, light is geometry and memory. My lungs burned, then adapted, then begged, and the cold slung itself like knuckled hands around my ribs. I tried to kick to find purchase on something, the skiff, a handhold, but the surface tilted and the air above became a fixed star, very small. I fought with the reflex of lung that demanded air and the practiced movement of someone who had been in water since he was small. I remember the eerie, buoyant quiet that presses around the ears, the way your thoughts loosen into slow, stupid beads. In that slow, I saw my father's face, not in detail, but the way his jaw used to settle when he was tired. I saw Lena, a photograph of her laughing at a diner, hair tucked under a knit cap. I thought of Marcus sanding a deck and muttering a bad joke. These were not memories so much as currency, spent fast in a place that didn't accept them. The pressure changed. The tug at my leg became less of a pull and more of a guiding hand, as if it wanted me to look. The water around my calf was no longer dark black, but a faint, troubled green. And in that green, I made out a shape that forced my eyes to furl like curtains. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could name. It had the length of a log and the sinuous motion of kelp, but there were edges in it that could have been bone. I felt, absurdly, as if it were studying me, the way a cat looks at a trapped mouse and decides whether the hunt is worth the trouble. Panic is an animal that can be fed. I fed it for a while, flailing, trying to get purchase on the skiff, as if clinging to it was any less foolish than clinging to the idea of fairness. My hands found rope and hardware, a tangle of things that pulled loose under my grasp. The surface above me fractured with a flare of white as something heavy, too heavy, brushed the hull. Somewhere on shore, a dog barked, long and then two quick answers. Someone shouted, "Michael!" in a voice that cracked like a novice violinist. Hope is a small, foolish thing. It hooked into the night like a snagged fish. When I broke the surface, the night was an orchestra of broken sounds, a man cursing, a motor coughing, the far-off wail of a siren that could be an ambulance or a string blown by wind. I sputtered. The lantern lay upside down, smoking, throwing a watery light. Finn lay at the bow, his eyes wide and fixed, panting in wild, ridiculous joy when he could still stand. I grabbed him and felt the hairs of his back slick under my palm. There was a slice of relief so sharp it hurt. I hauled myself up over the stern and into the boat. For a breathless moment, I was convinced I had survived a moment that would make for a good story, something to tell over cold coffee with colleagues. Then the tug returned, not at my ankle, but at the hull itself, and the skiff groaned as if under the weight of a sleeping thing. The rope I had tried to secure ran tight and hummed like wire. The bay around us changed tone, the fog thickened and pressed close, and the bell sounded again, a note I began to recognize like a language I had no right to understand. On the shore, shapes moved. A torch swiped the fog and caught on a figure. Sheriff Cole, his jacket flapping like a bad flag. He shouted my name and made a motion that might have been to throw a line. Marcus, breathless and dirty from the job he had been at, burst from behind a clump of reeds, swearing and waving his arms like some mad conductor. People came out of the houses like neighbors in a prayer group, faces pale and open. There was a small cluster of light as someone sat down to snap a picture with a phone. The flash caught for an instant and made everything stark, like a photograph capturing a lie. They hauled me toward the pier, hands anonymous and steady. I felt the rope in my hand tug again, and for a second, the world lurched as if deciding whether it wanted to keep me. I thought then, with the naivete of someone who believes there are still bargains to be struck, that if I could only cut the line, the thing would let us go. I reached for my knife with numb fingers and found only wet canvas and the cold iron of the harness. Above the fog, in the place where men with flashlights and too many questions stand, someone said the word hypothermia. Someone else said miracle. The sheriff muttered a caution about the currents and the unmarked hazards. I wanted to agree with all of them. Instead, I watched the water where the rope went down, and the bell, whether real or imagined, repeated itself like a metronome. The boat shuddered, then stilled. What I did not know then, what I did not know for days, weeks, and the sort of slow months that make you rearrange the furniture of your fear, was that the tug had a memory. It had a cadence. It was not a random cruelty. It expected an answer, and when one was not forthcoming, it wrote its own reply into the wood and rope. They drove me home, wrapped in blankets like a package meant for someone else. Marcus rode with me, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, swearing softly at nothing and everything. The hospital checked me for cuts, for the usual things. They took my temperature and told me to keep warm. Finn slept on the floor like a guiltless saint. I lay awake and listened to the house breathe and thought the bell would follow me in sleep. When I finally closed my eyes, the last thing that I heard was the faint, impossible peal, like a teacup struck in another room, and I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, that the night was not finished speaking to me. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The days after the water kept me in a kind of small, bright stupor. People asked how I was, and I gave them the answers they wanted. Bruises fade, lungs clear, a shaved-off grin toward normal. But nights were a different ledger. Sleep came in the thin currency of stupor and nightmares. I woke reaching for air I hadn't earned, once I found my hands unconsciously skimming the corner of the mattress, as if trying to find the edge of a hull. Everyone in town had an opinion about what happened. Sheriff Cole wrote it down as an odd accident, and then stopped trying to explain away the bell, because explanations die fast when they meet a town's memory. Marcus swore he saw a shimmer under the pier the night after, a ripple like a hand gone to sleep. He swore by the old men in the yard and by his mother's name. Mrs. Boone at the library gave me photocopies of clippings from 1908, brittle paper that seemed to flinch at the light. There was an old ferry, she said, tapping a faded headline. Eleanor Gray, a storm. People missing. Folks claimed the bell was heard years after it disappeared. She did not laugh when she said it. She had lived long enough to know the kinds of things the bay keeps. I tried to make sense of it in practical ways. I inspected the skiff for damage and the rope for teeth marks. I took apart the lantern to see if anything had lodged in its casing. I drove to the old Coast Guard boathouse and traced knotwork like a detective tracing fingerprints. The rope had frayed in a way that made no sense. The fibers seemed softened like they'd been caressed, not chewed. The buoy's paint had flaked as if from time, not abrasion. None of it settled into a neat narrative. The nights were worst. The bell found me in dreams at first, a thin, precise ring that rolled under my stern as if the sound had been set inside my ribs. Then it graduated to waking hours. I would be in the garage grunting against the stubborn bolt, and the bell would peal, quick as a notice. Once in the grocery store, with a cart half full of nothing, it tolled as if happening on the far side of the produce aisle. My hands tightened on the cart handle as if bracing for a wave. People told stories, and towns love a story that concentrates fear into a shape. Some said the bay takes what it wants. Others said the bell belonged to men who died claiming debts. Sheriff Cole, who had spent half his life on those roads, admitted that he'd had calls. A fisherman who swore he heard it 2 nights in a row, a teen who said his brother had gone outside and not come back. The county logged a missing report that later vanished into the drawer marked unresolved. The bay had a way of leaving paperwork thin and inadequate. There was one fact that burned through all of the rumor. The sound recurred with an insistence that suggested pattern rather than whim. It rang most often near tides that shuffled in like sleight of hand. It rang on nights when the fog moved like a living sheet. It did not appear to be random. And because pattern suggests purpose, I began to lean toward the idea that whatever made that sound had something it wanted. I started going back to the cove, at first because habit is a kind of prayer. The pier became a spindle around which my days spun. Check the buoys, tighten the cleats, sweep away the wet leaves that glued themselves to the planks. Marcus came sometimes, and sometimes he did not. Finn came always. There were nights the dog would sit and stare past the water, his neck cords taut, a low whine crawling from his chest. Once I caught him pawing at the rope we had cut free that night, as if he recognized old friends. The sheriff, trying to be reasonable in the only way a small-town lawman knows how, set up a watch. They threw light and engine noise at the water like human-made wards. Cameras went up on poles, grainy and eager to catch ghosts in pixels. For a while, the bell obligingly showed up on the recordings, a spike of audio with no visible source, like a scratch in a record. They played it at town hall, a thin note that made half the councilmen look away. The sheriff called it anomalous audio, and Margaret at the library called it evidence of memory. Neither word made the ringing easier to swallow. One night, 3 weeks after the incident, the bell came again while I was sitting on the pier, Finn beside me, Marcus in the car with his forehead pressed to the steering wheel. The fog had a taste like pennies. The note rolled across the water and paused, waiting. I stood because that felt like the only answer I could give a sound otherwise, and in the waiting, something in the water rearranged itself. This time, I did not go alone or in the small arrogance of a man expecting routine. Sheriff Cole walked with me, boots sinking a little in the wet sand. Behind us, Marcus carried a coil of rope and a lantern, not because he was optimistic, but because he had his own kind of reckless that refused to be left ashore. Margaret from the library held a battered book that smelled like smoke. She'd come because she said the past had a tendency to sit on the present if not invited to leave. We moved to where the rope had once run. The fog seemed to part like hands. The bell sounded, not loud, but exact, and then the water pushed up in a slow, deliberate swell that was not tide, not storm. For a moment, we all were small and useless against something that had been patient for 100 years. Finn barked and then stilled, a frozen instrument. "What does it want?" Marcus asked. Voice low. Sheriff Cole didn't answer in words. He drew a knife and with a sort of ceremonial slowness began to slide it along the rope that still lay coiled near the pier. Old rope they'd kept as evidence, now returned to the shore like a thing that minded being noticed. I realized then that the bay had never been simply taking. It had been waiting on a tether, a story unfinished. We had assumed cutting a line would free us. There are old lives that don't want to be untethered because being tied is a means of remembering who they were. Cole hesitated. "If it's a thing that remembers," he said finally, like an apology for using thing, "we don't know if cutting it is mercy or insult." Margaret opened the book and read, not loudly, a fragment of a log from the early 1900s. The bell tolled for the lost, yet kept calling, as if it were searching for names to answer it. Her voice ran thin with age and certainty. The fog leaned in. What we did was not a clean victory. We cut the line in the shallow, using the knife with hands that shook. The rope gave with a sound like a thread snapping in a quiet room. The bell answered, and this time its note was not a single brittle call. It uncoiled into a chord that sounded impossibly like a list of names. I did not know all of them then, but one sounded like a key in my chest. Finn. And there was no name for the jolt that brought mine. The water seemed to sigh and then flatten like a thing relieved of an itch. The fog began to lift, and with it the feeling that the bay was learning to speak through our mistakes. We hauled the old rope up and put it in the sheriff's truck like a relic. For a week the bells did not ring. The town slept a little softer. I slept sometimes without waking to the taste of cold on my tongue. But there are debts the sea does not forget. A month later, in the middle of a dry cold that pinned breath to air, I woke to a sound in my house, not over the water but inside the walls, a thin metallic ring, the exact timbre of the bell. It came from the attic where we had stored the old rope in a cardboard box for reasons that seemed responsible then. I climbed and found the box empty, the rope missing. Finn lay where he always lay, ears alert as if he had expected the sound too. In the corner of the attic, where the light pooled, lay a small chunk of metal with a single dirty notch that fit a bell's profile. I do not pretend to understand why the bay keeps calling or why some things need names. Perhaps it was never about punishment. Perhaps it was about memory. That the water, which remembers currents and the weight of engines and the last gasps of men and dogs, keeps those memories in sound until someone listens. We cut the tether and the sound followed into wood and air and attic. I took the metal and threw it back into the bay at dawn, heavy as guilt. It sank and the water closed above it like a lid. For a while, the bell was silent. The town moved on with the manageable business of living near something that could surprise you. Marcus took a steady job, and Sheriff Cole started sleeping with his light on. Margaret cataloged more local clippings, tighter this time. And me. I changed the way I lock my doors and how I walk past the pier, hands in my pockets like a man who keeps a small secret in his coat. But sailors in towns know. The sea keeps more than it gives, and sometimes the things it refuses to relinquish find other ways to be heard. Every so often, when the fog rolls in like the hem of a dark dress, I think I hear it, a bell, distant or maybe only an echo in my skull. Finn's ears prick up. He is old now, and he stares down the beach as if remembering the exact place a thing went under. I keep a coil of rope in the garage, not out of superstition, but because repetition keeps the mind busy. Sometimes I walk the cove at dawn and lay a hand on the water and thank it for letting me up. This is what I know and what I cannot prove. The bay keeps names, and sometimes it answers when called. We cut a line, and for a while the noise stopped. We buried a piece of iron and hoped that would be enough. But the memory of the night sits in my chest like a bell weight. It taught me that there are things in water that are patient enough to wait for you to come back. Not to punish, necessarily, but to remind you that they were there first. If you ever find yourself near Grand Traverse Bay, when the fog comes off the water like wool, keep an ear for a thin, precise ringing. It may mean nothing, or it may be a voice with a very long wait. Either way, remember this story. Use your names like oars. And if you hear a bell where no bell should be, don't assume it's calling someone else. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.